El Chapo is currently holed up in Colorado, but he's not exactly enjoying the mountain views. He's locked away at USP Florence Ad Max, the most secure prison in the world, also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, or better yet, Supermax. This place isn't just a prison, it's a fortress designed to break even the most dangerous criminals. Inmates spend most of their day in solitary confinement, with tiny soundproofed cells that make sure they barely see or hear another human being. And on today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're going to reveal what El Chapo's life in prison is actually like. In 2019, Joaquin Guzman, also known as El Chapo, was sentenced to life in prison for his many crimes as the former head of the Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico. These crimes included conducting a continuing criminal enterprise, large-scale narcotics violations, drug trafficking conspiracies, murder conspiracies, money laundering conspiracies, and unlawful use of a firearm, which is kind of anticlimactic. And that's why today El Chapo is locked away in the same infamous prison that once housed criminals like Ted Kaczynski. Not that many people feel sorry for him. After all, he once told investigators he personally killed between 2,000 and 3,000 people, the population of a small town. And that's not even counting the countless lives lost to the cartel that he ran, or the devastation caused by the drugs he trafficked. But now that we have the basics, let's walk through a day in El Chapo's life at ADX Florence. 6 to 7 a.m. Guzman wakes up in the morning after a rough night's sleep. As with most prisoners in the Supermax facility, bad sleep quality is a problem. That's partly because his bed is made of cement, one of the least comfortable materials on Earth. There's a thin mat, but no real mattress, just enough padding to keep him from sleeping directly on cold, hard concrete. And if that wasn't bad enough, 3 steel posts rise from the bed's edges, reaching just above the mat. If the guards decide he's a problem, or if they're just having a bad day, they could strap him down at the wrists, legs, and even his head. No plopping into bed for Guzman unless he wants to crack his head on solid steel. He opens his eyes to look around at the 7 by 12 foot reinforced concrete cell that he's trapped in. To put that in perspective, it's about half the size of an average North American parking space, or if you prefer a cozier comparison, almost twice the size of a king-size bed. But that's it. His living quarters are less than your average Walmart parking spot. The reinforced concrete is meant to prevent escape attempts, which is good considering El Chapo has already escaped from prison twice. In 2001, it was via a laundry cart he hid himself in. His second successful escape attempt in 2015 involved him making his way out through an elaborate tunnel. We'll get back to that one later, as it's influenced his current prison privileges. Neither of those escapes are likely to happen again given El Chapo's current living conditions. The former cartel boss, like other prison inmates, now spends 23 hours in his soundproof and tamper-proof cell. Guzman walks over to his stainless steel sink, which also happens to be his toilet and water fountain. An appetizing mix. Most people start their morning by washing up, brushing their teeth, and freshening up for the day. But in Supermax, water is strictly controlled. Every drop is rationed. His sink, his shower, and his toilet are all on timers. And forget about a tap. There isn't one. It could potentially be broken off and used as a weapon. So Guzman brushes his teeth and washes his face as quickly as he can. Then he goes back to his bed to wait for his meal. 7 to 8 a.m. In most prisons, inmates go down to the mess hall for food, but in a Supermax, wardens want to prevent inmates from socializing, leaving their cells, or posing any danger to the guards as much as possible. So here, Guzman gets room service. A guard slips a food tray through a small slot in the metal cell door. Guzman grabs it and he looks over the day's offerings. Stale bran flakes, an apple, and a cup of oatmeal, with a texture so thick he could probably use it to add some padding to his concrete bed. At least there is one luxury: 2 cartons of milk. One of the only ways that prisoners in Supermax prisons can protest their conditions is via hunger strikes, which happen relatively often. But in this case, a hunger strike might be a better option, as according to his former prisoners, the quality of this food feels like it's part of their punishment. He gulps it all down and passes the tray back through the slot to the guard. The guard inspects the tray to make sure Guzman didn't break off a piece to use in a potential escape, and then he leaves. 8 to 9 a.m. Suddenly, one of the rarest events Guzman can experience in his prison cell occurs. A small shaft of sunlight hits the wall opposite the window. The sun must be at exactly the right angle today. Part of the inmate's punishment at Colorado's Supermax facility is being completely deprived of sky and sunlight. To pay for their crimes, inmates basically get zero access to the outdoors. The window in Guzman's prison cell is small, and when we say small, we mean it is tiny. And it's designed in a way that prisoners can't actually see the landscape around them. They only get a tiny glimpse of the prison roof and a sliver of the sky if they're lucky. Part of the reason for this construction is to stop El Chapo and every other prisoner from being able to understand exactly where their cell is in relation to the prison layout. This is meant to prevent coordination with the outside world in order to organize escape attempts. In case any prisoner starts to get an inkling of where in the prison they're located, some extra security measures help deter them, namely that no prisoner stays in one cell for too long. But we'll get to that soon. In the meantime, Guzman shuffles off to the one place in his cell where he can almost feel the sunlight, and he just enjoys that for the time being. We never said life in a Supermax prison was particularly exciting. 9 to 10 a.m. Now it's back to one of El Chapo's favorite pastimes in prison. Is it frantically doing push-ups, planning revenge on his enemies? Nope, it is letter writing. Guzman writes lots and lots and lots of letters from prison, several hundred of them at this point. Most of them are in Spanish, since his English isn't great, and a lot are addressed to his lawyer or the judge who oversaw his case. Guzman sits at the concrete desk and chair in his cell, and he gets out a pen to write. All of the concrete in-room furniture is secured to the ground so he can't use it to aid in an escape or in attacks against the guards. And the pen Guzman is working with isn't all that normal either. To prevent prisoners from harming themselves, the Supermax controls what items they have access to. While most people think this just includes the obvious weapons, knives, ropes, and guns, the list is actually pretty extensive. And that's because after years of staring at nothing but concrete, prisoners tend to get pretty desperate and pretty creative when it comes to finding a way out. So the pen Guzman writes with is about the size of a crayon, made of rubber, and unfortunately for him, just a little floppy. Not exactly great for writing, but there's a reason for it. Hardwood and metal pens can be turned into weapons, dangerous to both guards and inmates. And in Supermax, they're not taking the risk. Guzman sets about writing his latest complaint about the lack of visitation rights for his wife, Emma Coronel, and daughters. His 2 daughters are studying in Mexico, so any visit would require a bit of travel and coordination. In 2021, Guzman's wife was also sentenced for drug trafficking. Who doesn't love a family business? Since her release in 2023, the judge has been reluctant to let Emma visit Guzman, mainly as she was one of the people who helped El Chapo escape prison the last time. 10 to 11 a.m. Guzman sits back on his bed to do one of the only other things he can: watch TV. It's a 13-inch screen, and the only programming allowed is educational, religious, and some recreational content. One report says that some Netflix movies and DVDs are also available as long as they're rated PG. So El Chapo probably can't watch El Chapo in his cell, which is a real shame. He's more likely to find the prison recreation department's channel playing yoga and step aerobic tutorials. But it is better than staring at concrete, marginally. 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. The guards show up outside of his cell. Must be an exercise day. They slowly unlock the heavy reinforced metal door and order Guzman to step up to the bars. It's standard procedure. First a full frisk, then the shackles. Only when he's fully restrained will they escort him from the cell. Reports vary on exactly where Guzman gets to exercise. Some prisoners use an exercise pit. There might even be more than one. But when we called the warden to confirm, we were told to mind our own business. El Chapo probably doesn't get to visit the semi-outdoor cage. Instead, he gets about 1 hour per week to exercise, likely in an indoor cell. He's never alone, always escorted there by 2 to 3 guards. And even then, he stays shackled the entire time. So yeah, we're guessing burpees aren't really on the workout plan. Maybe if he behaves himself, Guzman could earn access to a semi-outdoor cage. But even then, it's not exactly a breath of fresh air. It's still mostly enclosed, shielding him from elements and sunlight, so don't expect a scenic jog. Prisoners in Supermax pace around a tiny concrete courtyard, boxed in by barbed wire, while armed guards watch from the towers, ready to take a shot if needed. Not exactly the best spot for a relaxing morning Pilates session. And then, as suddenly as one of the only hours outside of his cell began, it ends. The guards escort Guzman back. He shuffles shackled up down the hall toward his cell. 12 to 1 p.m. Lunchtime. Not exactly that Guzman actually worked up a sweat or anything, but it's still good to get another meal. Well, actually, considering in 2018 the Supermax was spending $3.50 for each inmate's meals per day, maybe it's not that good. And as the lunchtime tray is slipped through the door, he realizes it is as disappointing as usual. A small hamburger, unsalted potato wedges, fruit that may have expired some point last year, and ketchup. The potatoes are cold, the burger's so hot he can't touch it for 20 minutes. Everything is completely unseasoned except for only one spot on the patty that apparently had an entire salt shaker dumped on it. This Supermax must cause weight loss. 1 to 2 p.m. Guzman bangs on the bars and the walls to get a guard's attention. He knows the cell is soundproof, but he figures he'll try anyway. There's not much else to do. He's supposed to get at least 2 15-minute phone calls per month, ones he'd love to use not only to catch up with loved ones, but to confer with the lawyer filing his appeal. However, as Guzman recently complained in one of his many letters to the judge overseeing his case, he's been in the Supermax for a year and have only been authorized 9 telephone calls to my attorney. Realizing once again that no one can hear him banging, he sits down to write another angry letter. about how life in Supermax sucks. 2 to 3 p.m. Wow, today is really full of activities for El Chapo compared to a regular day in this prison cell. It's moving day. As we mentioned, the Supermax constantly keeps prisoners unaware of their location and their surroundings as one of its top priorities. To this end, prisoners get moved every 3 months from one cell to another. If they ever get an inkling of where in the Supermax facility they might be, they immediately get thrown off again. And if you think that the move itself creates a possible opening for the prisoners to escape, think again. Once again, the guards frisk El Chapo and shackle him so they can take him through the hallways. And there is no ordinary hallways. These hallways have 1,400 different remote-controlled steel doors. If there's ever an escape attempt, a violent outburst, or any other emergency, the response is instant. With one press of a button in the control room, the entire prison locks down, every door sealed, every movement stopped, until the issue is identified and order is restored. Slowly, El Chapo makes his way through the halls with the guards close by his side. Everything looks the same. Nothing gives him a clue as to where he was or where he might be going until eventually he gets to a door that looks just like his old door, and he walks in with his handful of belongings and he waits to see what he'll find. 3 to 4 p.m. Part of the reason Guzman is anxious about his new cell is because some of them hold unpleasant surprises. It's not uncommon to walk into a new room and find the walls smeared with feces. And as you might imagine, some prisoners that have been in the Supermax for years mentally fall apart. Some had, well, let's say, issues to begin with. Guzman walks in and thankfully he sees no feces on these walls. That's a good day. He looks at the same 4-inch window, the same concrete bed, and gets ready to settle into the exact same routine as usual. 4 to 5 p.m. There's one trick prisoners can use in the Supermax to communicate with each other, and El Chapo figures now's the time to check who his neighbor is and hope it's someone he can occasionally chat with. Lots of notorious criminals are locked up in the Supermax. The Shoe Bomber, the Boston Marathon Bomber, the Unabomber. There's probably non-bombers there as well, we assume. Maybe he'll end up speaking with one of them. To attempt to communicate, El Chapo takes a toilet paper roll and he holds it over either the sink or the shower drain. He'll try both to see which works. He blows through the roll as hard as he can to clear the pipes of any water they might have in him, creating as open a communication channel as one can get at the Supermax. Then, continuing to hold the roll over the drain, he talks into it. Hola, hablas español? After a while, a response comes back. Hello, no, but I can talk. Since El Chapo's English isn't the best, he exchanges a few words with, well, whoever it is, holding on to those precious few moments of human connection. 5 to 6 p.m. It's time for some light reading. Prisoners are allowed to ask for books out of the prison library, always subject to good behavior, of course, and they can read them in their cell. Once again, the language barrier makes reading a little difficult for El Chapo, but he manages to muddle through. There is one light in his cell that's controlled by the guards. Without it, it's pretty dark in his room, no matter what time of day it is. With it, Guzman has enough light to make out the words on the page and read. He sits on his bed with his latest book and he passes the time. This is a huge change of pace from his first prison experience in Punta Grande. There, he managed to run his whole drug empire from inside of the prison. Perhaps one of the many reasons he's not allowed to make frequent phone calls now. There would be parties, yes, parties all the time. With a long sigh, Guzman sits back and wonders why he ever tried to escape his first prison, where he was having as close to the time of his life as he can have behind bars. 6 to 7 p.m. The last meal of the day slides underneath El Chapo's prison door, signaling that soon it'll be time for bed. Tonight's delicacy is meatloaf. Not that any particular flavor of meat can be identified. A scoop of potato, the most flavorless gravy known to man, and 2 pieces of bread. Even though the meal is anything but appetizing, eating at least gives Guzman something to do for the next hour. Slowly, he chews on his meal. The meatloaf in particular requires a lot of chewing, and he wonders how many days he's been in the Supermax at this point. Time seems to blend together when you're having no fun at all. 7 to 8 p.m. Guzman decides to take a quick shower. The water seems to be on right now before getting ready for bed. He doesn't get nearly as much water as he'd like since the shower is timed. That's a safety precaution so prisoners don't accidentally drown in their cells. While washing himself, Guzman looks down at the shower floor and he's reminded of his last escape attempt in 2015 from Altiplano in Mexico. His associates dug a tunnel under the prison that connected to a hole in his shower floor. One night, Guzman slipped away through the hole, and by the time the guards were alerted, he'd already hopped on a motorcycle that had been left for him and he drove away. The water flow now stops completely. Guzman dries himself, puts on his clothes, and goes back to his book in bed. His back and head are in agony, like they have been for days. Unfortunately, medical attention doesn't come quickly into Supermax for anything other than dire emergencies. In September 2021, Guzman submitted an affidavit to a U.S. court, essentially saying that his physical and mental health were falling apart. Something about the total lack of sunlight, social contact, family contact, and no hope of escape before death. "I have suffered a lot," Guzman writes, "due to the treatment in ADMAX. I now suffer from headaches, memory loss, muscle cramps, stress, and depression. I have suffered a lot." Suddenly, the light switches off. Guzman lies down and gets ready to sleep. As the light being off means the power to the TV is off as well, he closes his eyes trying to drift off into a fitful sleep, but he knows it won't last. At some point the guards will come through, making their rounds, banging on his door, just to remind him that privacy doesn't exist here. It's just another part of the Supermax life, and another thing he complained about in a recent letter. And so ends another day at Supermax. There is some kind of method to the madness behind El Chapo and most prisoners at the Supermax's daily routine. No one has escaped since ADX Florence was founded in 1994, and Guzman has spent time in cell block H and range 13, which are reserved for the worst offenders. That being said, groups like Amnesty International agree that El Chapo deserves to remain in prison for life and kept away from innocent people, but they argue this kind of treatment in prison facilities crosses the line into inhumane. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, called Supermax prisons cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Many everyday citizens don't really care, as El Chapo is responsible for the murders of thousands of people at least, and what happens to him doesn't trouble most members of society. But many now say it's a myth that only the worst criminals are locked up in a Supermax facility. Eric G. King of Kansas City got sentenced to 10 years in prison at 29 years old for throwing 2 Molotov cocktails into a local congressional office. The Congressman Emanuel Cleaver II was not in his office at the time, neither was anyone else, as it was 2:52 a.m. Essentially, it was arson of an empty building and property damage. But since King got into fights in a couple of other prisons he was held in, eventually he ended up in Colorado's infamous Supermax. He described his experience in a Reddit AMA. "After years, the silence or kind of silence becomes its own noise. You can become immobile, psychological issues start to pop up. No one's there for you. No one cares if you get hurt, sick, mentally unwell, if the food is horrible, or if you're sad or having a depressing week. You are on your own in every way for years." The silence and the isolation are two constants in every one of El Chapo's days at the Supermax, slowly eroding his sanity and whatever existed of his humanity in the first place over time. Even Robert Hood, an ex-warden of the prison, had only bad things to say about it. This is not built for humanity. I think that being there day by day is worse than death. Do you think El Chapo's treatment in Supermax is fair, or is it too extreme? Should prisons be this harsh, even for the world's most dangerous criminals? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.
If there is one person the U.S. authorities do not want escaping from prison, it's the notorious Mexican drug kingpin, one Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. This man, from meager beginnings, the son of a farming family from Sinaloa, became an enemy number one of the United States, and a very rich man too. They have him locked up now, but El Chapo has escaped from prison before. Not once, but twice. So it goes without saying that right now he is guarded like no one else on the planet. Could this criminal Houdini get out again? Let's have a look. First, let's see how he managed to escape from prison the first time. In 1993, the LA Times ran the headline, "Mexico arrests reputed top drug kingpin." He was arrested in Guatemala, not far from the Mexican border. The charges against him were murder, kidnapping, and of course, drug trafficking. The authorities said he was behind a huge trafficking operation in a massive tunnel that ran from Tijuana to San Diego, where drugs were carried through. Digging tunnels, as you'll see, was something of a forte for Guzman and his crew. He was extradited to Mexico and got 20 years 9 months to be served in a maximum security prison. There, it said he controlled the place and lived in comfort, with the guards doing what he told them to do. While he could easily run his operations from there, as time went by, he feared extradition to the US. It was time to go. It was January 19, 2001 when he made the first escape. A prison guard named Francisco El Chito Cambreros Rivera opened the electronic door to his cell when Guzman hid himself in a laundry basket. He was pushed through a series of doors and eventually got out of the main door. From there, he was taken in the trunk of a car to a designated spot, and when the time was right, he took off into the night. Like that, he was gone. It might sound too easy, but it was found out that he not only had guards on his payroll, but also the prison director. Even the cops were paid to make his getaway into the night that much easier. It turned out to be a bit of an embarrassment for the Mexican authorities. All the bribes Guzman paid added up to around $2.5 million. So this could never happen again, right? Wrong. He kept on doing what he did and became Mexico's most wanted man. But despite that, he managed to evade capture. Then on the 22nd of February 2014, after an operation between Mexican and US authorities, he was captured again. They had him, and they thought that was it. He was not going to bribe his way out of prison this time. When being moved around, he was surrounded by the military and the police. Even the A-team couldn't have made the plan come together to extricate this guy from the arms of the law. This time, he was locked up in a very restricted area. His cell had no windows and he had little contact with anyone. He had a Spartan cell, and this time no luxuries. A bed, a shelf, a shower, a toilet bowl, and a basin. That's what he got. He was allowed some visits and he had the right to receive the maximum amount of money to buy hygiene products. That was about $48 US. Not so much for the man who had millions. He could take an hour out of his cell a day, but the guards were told not to communicate with him. How on earth could he escape a second time then? Well, on the 11th of July 2015, he did just that. You see, there was a blind spot for the security cameras, and that was where the shower was. At close to 9 p.m. that night, he was seen going to that part of the cell, and that's where he vanished. Prior to that, for months, El Chapo's men had been digging a tunnel, and the end point was at that shower cell. The digging had been so noisy at times, some of the other inmates had complained about strange noises. El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel, played a big part in orchestrating the escape. El Chapo had landed not far from the prison where the digging began, and he had even managed to get a smartwatch smuggled into his cell so the diggers knew the coordinates. This was some escape, and the tunnel even had ventilation and lighting. To get out fast, El Chapo used a motorbike, but it was especially made to run on rails. This contraption was also used for the excavation process. Authorities later said the tunnel was 0.93 miles long, 5 feet 7 inches high, and 30 inches in width. It was 33 feet underground, and so El Chapo used a ladder to get down there. He was a free man, but his freedom didn't last very long. After an armed raid at a residence on the 8th of January 2016, Guzman managed to get away, once again using tunnels. He was captured shortly after though. Now, the USA wanted him again, and the proceedings got in the way to extradite him. Guzman's men tried anything to prevent this from happening, and even assassinated a federal judge. It didn't work. He was finally extradited on January 9, 2017 to the USA, exactly 18 years after this first prison escape. Right after his sentencing, in which he received life in prison plus 30 years, he just disappeared. That's because on his way to prison, the safest bet was to take him to an undisclosed location. Even Guzman's lawyers didn't know where he was. It was later revealed that he ended up at what's called America's highest security prison. That is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. It's known in short as ADX Florence. This is where the worst of the worst go. In prison terms, it's the end of the road. There are way more guards here to the number of inmates than at other prisons. Inmates are locked up 23 hours a day. When they are allowed out, it may come at any time, day or night. So even if somehow a plan could be devised by the people on the outside, they wouldn't know when their guy was out of his cell. The 7 by 12 feet cell has a bed, a stool, and a desk all made of poured concrete. The cells are soundproofed so prisoners can't shout and communicate with each other. The inmates never know where they are in the facility because they never see through a window that will allow them to guess their location. Even when they can exercise, it is not a yard, but an empty swimming pool, so they can't see over the walls. It's not a big one either, and it only takes 10 steps to walk from end to end. All over the prison there are motion detectors and cameras, and the thick steel doors can only be opened with remote control. Officers monitor all parts of the prison from a control room, and if anything strange should happen, they can hit a panic button which will automatically lock every door in the prison. The prison also has pressure pads, so an alert is sent if someone should stand on one of those pads. If someone could somehow get past the pressure pads and the cameras and get outside, they would have to scale a 12-foot tall razor wire fence, and they'd have to do that in front of heavily armed guards in one of the many towers. Other guards will walk around with attack dogs. It's very likely that Guzman is also in the most secure unit of this ultra-secure prison, which is called Range 13. By the way, guards at this prison are vetted to prevent anyone corrupt getting a job. While working, they're told to communicate with the prisoners as little as possible. It's escape-proof is what most people say, and it's not a nice place to end up. A former warden once described it like this: "This supermax is life after death. It's long-term. In my opinion, it's far much worse than death." Others have said how eerily quiet the place is because no two inmates move at the same time. It's very clean. Everything is spotless. So when journalists have gone in, they've been very surprised. It might look as bright as heaven if it weren't hell. In fact, that's how one warden described it, like a clean version of hell. He told 60 Minutes, "I don't know what hell is, but I do know the assumption would be for a free person, it's pretty close to it." This is how one inmate described it. The purpose is to gradually tear a person down mentally and physically through environmental and physical deprivation. For an inmate, it's kind of like having the place to yourself. Some people have said, because it's like this, the only way a person could escape would be if they actually had the prison warden in their pocket, which is never going to happen. There are only around 400 inmates, some of whom include Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Terry Nichols, the Oklahoma City bomber. Just to get near the place, you'd be spotted, and Guzman can forget about buying land near it. This prison is in a remote location. There's not much for miles around. Guzman has visitors, but only his lawyer and his 2 daughters have been allowed to see him. He cannot actually touch anyone who visits him. He's told his lawyer because of the oppressive conditions, he regularly throws up, has headaches, and also sinus trouble. He said it's also very hard to sleep because the lights are on all the time. If prisoners do want to break from the monotony, they at least have a TV, but that only plays religious and educational programs. This is how another person who's retired from the prison described this place. Supermax is austere, and it's run with absolute structure and security in mind. From an operational perspective, it's the most secure prison on Earth. But if the man known as Papillon escaped from the notorious Devil's Island penal colony, and if those 3 guys really did escape from Alcatraz, maybe no prison on Earth is 100% secure. Just about anyone in the corrections business would disagree, but maybe El Chapo could get out of this one. What are the chances of Mr. Guzman escaping from the place nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies? Let's think about it. If he were to get out of his cell, maybe he'd have to do that by bribing a guard. But they've been vetted. Perhaps the only way a guard would offer him help would be because Guzman's men had kidnapped his family. But as only one man moves at a time, that prisoner is being watched from the control room. We just don't think he could go out the front door. He certainly couldn't get past those pressure pads, and the guards in the towers, and the guards with the dogs, and over a massive fence that would cut him to pieces. All the time, everything is caught on CCTV. He would need a small army on the outside, and since the location is in the middle of nowhere, that army would be seen. Even if he employed some great hacker to hack the prison system and open the doors, he'd still have to face heavily armed guards. We can't see this happening outside of a Hollywood movie. But prisoners do have rights to see medical professionals, never mind how secure they are. This is the US law, so perhaps an escape could be made if El Chapo had to make a trip to a hospital. Possibly a catastrophic event, such as an earthquake or a fire, could result in an escape. But this is pretty unlikely. If prisoners were suddenly removed from their cells, they'd be shackled, so they wouldn't get anywhere fast. In conclusion, we think El Chapo will not be going anywhere. This prison is a techno fortress that no man could escape from. The only scenario that he gets out in is a screenplay which involves an apocalyptic event shutting down all the systems and the guards being eaten by monsters, after which El Chapo sneaks out the back door and begins a mission of survival. He'll be doing no digging out of prison this time, and no one will be holding out their hand and accepting a bribe.
Joaquin El Chapo Guzman sits at his cell in ADX Florence, the USA's so-called escape-proof lockup. He hasn't seen any natural light in years. He has to sleep with the lights in his cell on, something he says causes extreme mental anguish. And when he does get to leave his cell for an hour a day, he's just transported to another kind of cell by prison officers who barely speak to him. As prison officials have admitted, this kind of incarceration is a fate worse than death. But they also know that El Chapo has pulled off the unbelievable before, and perhaps he's thinking about doing it again. Today, you'll find out why this man is about as lockdown gets, and if indeed El Chapo could somehow disappear again from the clutches of the law. He did once say, "I've tunneled out of prison before, and I can do it again." We'll talk about the possibility of a breakout happening later, but let's first look at how El Chapo became known as the drug lord of the underworld. Say what you want about El Chapo, but you can't deny he was an industrious little fella. He was born into poverty on April 4th, 1957, in a little place called La Tuna in Sinaloa, Mexico. This was a small rural community where many people made their money from farming. That's what his parents did. His pop, Emilio Guzman Bustillos, and his mother, Maria Consuelo Lorera Perez. Life was hard for El Chapo, his 2 younger sisters, and 4 younger brothers. It was so hard that he actually started out having 3 older brothers, but they all died from natural causes very early in life. And what did these farmers, cattle ranchers by trade do to make ends meet? They branched out, of course, into opium, the stuff that can end up as heroin flowing through the veins of folks north of the border. El Chapo was special, and he showed that from a very young age. He gave up school when he was in the 3rd grade, and barely being able to read or write, decided to go into business himself to help the family out out, he sold oranges and candies, although it was never enough to make his violent father happy. His mother, though, she saw something in the kid. She'd watch him as he cut up little pieces of paper, tied them into bundles with elastic bands, and pretended he was rich. She later said about that, he'd count and recount them, then tie them up in little piles. Ever since he was little, he always had hopes. El Chapo left that godforsaken home when he was 15, and everything changed. This kid with big ambition saw a way out of poverty. His ticket to success lay in an illegal commodity, that of marijuana, a plant that could be grown cheaply and sent to the USA, where it could fetch enough money to make El Chapo a happy young man. It was at this point that he started working under the tutorship of his uncle, Pedro Aviles Perez. Perez, nicknamed the Mountain Lion, was what you'd call a first-generation Mexican narco, being one of the original entrepreneurs to flood the US with copious amounts of Mexican weed. The stuff was smoked with abandon by the many members of the so-called counterculture in the US in the late 60s and early 70s. But the problem with weed is it stinks a fair bit and it's pretty bulky. It's hard to say how much it costs because prices differ everywhere and it depends on how much you buy and who you buy it from. But let's say the average cost per kilo is about $2,000. That's not much, but what is a lot is the cost of a kilo of cocaine, which could cost in the region of $20,000 to $30,000 in the US today. So, in the 70s, when disco music was becoming a thing in the US and hippie culture made a way for self-loving group of people who liked snorting rails from nightclub bathrooms, the whole trafficking game changed. Cocaine became the new moneymaker. It still is, but let's save our conclusions about the war on drugs until the end of the show. In 1978, El Chapo's uncle was shot dead by federal cops, probably as a result of him being set up by another trafficker. Then the man called the original Mexican drug lord came onto the scene. He was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. This man became the godfather. He was untouchable, having officials and politicians in his pockets and having those connections in Colombia, where the coke was coming from. He made deals with other Mexican traffickers who had their own plazas in what became a federation of traffickers. But then, in 1984, something happened that changed everything. A massive marijuana plantation owned by Gallardo's Guadalajara cartel was raided and burned to the ground by the Mexican military, and it seemed the man that had orchestrated this was a US DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena Salazar. To say that Gallardo was furious would be an understatement. This 1,000-hectare plantation was worth a staggering $8 billion a year for the cartel, so with the help of some corrupt Mexican officials, Gallardo had Camarena kidnapped. The outcome was 30 hours of brutal torture with heavy objects and drills, and Camarena's body being wrapped in plastic and dumped in a field. The DEA was less than pleased, and so launched an investigation. To cut a long story short, that investigation was somewhat successful because by 1989, both Gallardo and his lieutenant, Rafael Caro Quintero, were behind bars. As you know, what tends to happen when arrests are made and some big people go down, a so-called power vacuum starts to form. These are usually torrid affairs that involve a lot of bloodshed as people fight for supremacy. After the Federation was abandoned, various cartels did their own thing. One of them was the Sinaloa cartel. At this point in the late 80s, the cartel was already making millions from trafficking cocaine. In the 90s, it got better, and in 1995, it was solely headed by who the DEA said was the new boss, El Chapo Guzman, after his partner Hector Luis Palma Salazar was arrested. They were good at trafficking too, using a network of tunnels to get the stuff across the border and into the USA. They used aircraft now and again, and perhaps their pièce de résistance was putting cocaine into chili pepper cans under the brand La Comadra, and then sending them to the US via trains and trucks. Word on the street is they got around $500 million worth of cocaine across the border using this method alone, with the packers in the warehouse apparently getting very high during the stuffing process. It was these fast methods that impressed the Colombians, who gave El Chapo the new name of El Rapido. As El Chapo and co were raking in the millions, some people in Sinaloa started calling Chapo Santa Claus and Robin Hood, with the reason being that he'd been investing quite a lot of money into the state's infrastructure, and for many people doing more good than any corrupt politician had ever done. Let's not forget, though, those who stood in his way generally got murdered. Then in 1989, there was a bit of a falling out between the Felix brothers of the Tijuana cartel and the Sinaloa boys. To cut the story short, El Chapo sent one of his main men to meet with the brothers, and that ended with Ramon Felix killing the man. Not only that, the brothers then told their men to murder members of the guy's family to prevent any kind of reprisal. These brothers were insanely dangerous, starting a trend in beheading and at one point throwing someone's innocent family members off a very high bridge. Things were turning ugly in Mexico, and you can be sure that El Chapo wasn't going to take these insults lying down. In the early 90s, his men went on their own killing sprees, taking out members of the Tijuana cartel. And it was at this point that the Mexican government had to take a stance. They couldn't just let blood flow through the streets as it had been doing, even though a good number of politicians, police, and other officials were getting rich from the proceeds of drug trafficking. In 1992, the Felix brothers opened fire on Guzman with AK-47s as he was driving through the streets of Guadalajara. Guzman got away. Not long after, some of his men, while posing as cops, walked into a nightclub and pretty much shot the place up. 6 people were killed, but the Felix brothers were apparently in the bathroom at the time and managed to escape. The bullets kept flying in this turf war, and mothers kept burying their boys. But you could say that the culmination of all this was what happened when Tijuana cartel hitmen turned up at a Guadalajara International Airport on May 24, 1993. They'd been informed that El Chapo was there, and he was hiding in a white Mercury Grand Marquis car. Naturally, the men filled the thing with bullets, although they should have checked who was inside it at first because El Chapo was certainly not in the car, but the Cardinal and Archbishop of Guadalajara named Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo was. They'd just taken out a man of the cloth, something that spurred Mexican President Carlos Salinas de Gortari into action. El Chapo, by the way, had been at the airport that day, but upon hearing the calamity had made a getaway, something you'll soon see he was very good at, and possibly the best escapologist in Mexican criminal history. So, the president was outraged. The good people of Mexico were outraged. The Tijuana cartel were like, damn, guess we can forget about that ticket to heaven. Their pictures and other suspects ended up in the newspapers with a bounty of $5 million for every head. One of those heads was El Chapo. While in hiding, he handed over $200 million to one of his most trusted men and said, if anything goes wrong, use this to take care of my family. He gave that same amount to some of his other men to ensure that his cartel's business could keep going if he were to be arrested. It was then that he forged a passport using the name Jorge Ramos Perez with the intention of hiding out in Guatemala for a while, although at this point the authorities were hot on his tail. He paid Guatemalan military official a cool $1.2 million to ensure safe passage, but it seems that the official had set El Chapo up. On June 9, 1993, Guatemalan troops swooped in on El Chapo as he was staying at a hotel on the Guatemala-Mexican border. In no time at all, he was sitting on a military plane in handcuffs, thinking about how his first stint behind bars would go at Mexico's Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 2, perhaps one of the best prisons in the world for anyone who has suitcases full of cash at their disposal. Now we come to part 2 of this show, the first of El Chapo's great escapes. But before we do that, we have to ask just how much money this short-in-stature drug lord had at the time. It's always been a tricky question, foremost because traffickers have said the authorities exaggerate how much cash they have. That cash made from drugs pays for a vast operation that might include up to hundreds of people. On top of that, they hardly file their taxes, and often they keep their money offshore. That's why when they're caught, the authorities never seem to get their hands on the millions or billions, and even if they did, if they were corrupt, would they always report it? Well, look at it this way. There have been cocaine hauls in the US of 20 tons. The street price for that would be about $1.3 billion. Sure, as former traffickers have said on podcasts, no one person gets anything close to that, but still, when you consider that there's always cocaine in the US and in Europe, some of the traffickers are making many millions, some of them billions. That's even after they paid scores of officials, the suppliers, the transporters, and various middlemen for every shipment. Right now, someone is selling cocaine. Someone is doing some lines, perhaps even in the British Houses of Parliament bathrooms, just as the Prime Minister says he is absolutely determined to fight drugs. That actually happened. There's no doubt people are racking up lines in some of New York's banking offices and certainly at a nightclub or in a living room near you, wherever you are in the world. That's a lot of coke for the cartels to work with. It was said at his height El Chapo was making $2 to $4 billion a year, but you can bet your life he never had that at his disposal. Still, he was doing all right, just as his enemies were. Just to give you an idea of how much power the cartels had and still have, when that cardinal was shot, the Catholic Church in Mexico didn't think it was a hit gone wrong. Who on earth, they said, would confuse a cardinal for a drug trafficker? They also said, isn't it weird how this murdered cardinal had been talking for a long time about Mexican politicians being in bed with the narcos? They thought it was a purposeful hit on the cardinal with men in suits involved. So, do you really think El Chapo, with his many millions and superabundant power, was going to stay behind bars for long? He got 20 years, after which he told the TV cameras, "I am but a simple farmer." If he was, it's strange that he had servants in prison, that even the guards were at his beck and call. It's strange that he was treated like a king and was allowed to run his empire from his luxurious cell, and that his brother and business partner Arturo could come and go as he pleased. The investigative journalist Anabel Hernandez said he contacted judges and politicians from there and regularly had sit-downs with business associates. It should also be mentioned here that it was later said in court that El Chapo was working with the DEA, just as drug agencies all over the world sometimes work with traffickers if they agree to set up other traffickers traffickers. One U.S. critic said El Chapo was duping U.S. agencies into fighting its enemies. Later, the hitman and gangster named Juan Carlos Ramirez testified in a U.S. court saying that Mr. Chapo was bribing corrupt DEA agents with prostitutes, gifts, and apartments. As the years passed, people talked about El Chapo being El Dueño of the prison, which basically means the owner. When he was bored with business, he sometimes had prostitutes smuggled in or lovers, and often came with a handful of Viagra pills. He did at least have to go through some of the motions that regular prisoners face, and that was seeing a prison psychologist. After meeting with El Chapo, this man gave his assessment, saying he was egocentric, narcissistic, shrewd, persistent, tenacious, meticulous, discriminating, and secretive. We should just say here that during his lifetime, El Chapo had 18 kids with 7 different women. One of them was a former police officer named Zulema Hernandez, who wrote to Chapo when he was behind bars. As you know, he wasn't too literate, so when he wrote to her from prison, he had some hired help. One of the letters he wrote gives us some insight not only into how he sounded, but also the fact that he was planning to leave. He wrote, "Love, Christmas is around the corner, and nothing would make me happier than being close to you, your skin and your lips, but everything is uncertain. Even though I haven't lost sight of seeing you, I don't want to promise any specific day because then it doesn't work out." By the way, this woman ended up being shot and killed sometimes later, and a Z carved into her body. That's because the hit was the work of El Chapo's enemies, the outfit known as Los Zetas. She'd helped run his drug business from prison, but as things tend to go, it was a risky venture. After 8 years living in relative luxury, he was indicted in the U.S. for money laundering and trafficking obscene amounts of cocaine across the borders, and it was looking like he might be extradited after the Supreme Court of Mexico made a deal with the U.S. The last thing he wanted was to end up in a U.S. prison where bribing officers wasn't so easy, so he planned his escape. On January 19, 2001, as one story goes, he bribed prison guard Francisco El Chito Camberos Rivera. The officer opened up the cell and Chapo got in a laundry basket, after which, with the help of a maintenance man, he was rolled out the front door. The maintenance guy helped Chapo into his car trunk and drove him to a gas station, whereupon he went inside to buy something. El Chapo slipped out of the trunk and did that famous vanishing act of his. Camberos did some prison time for that, although the prison authorities had apparently also been paid, as had the cops, who didn't bother looking for El Chapo until he'd had enough time to leave the state. This all cost El Chapo in the region of $2.5 million. But did it really all go down that way? No, it didn't. According to that brave journalist Anabel Hernandez, she discovered documents and video footage that revealed El Chapo hadn't done the laundry basket thing and instead had left the prison through the door wearing a police uniform. She said that high-ranking cops had all been paid, as had various ministers and prison officials. They'd helped him every step of the way and had been paid handsomely to do so. They even gave him a police escort, and as a matter of convenience, they were at the prison the day after for when they had to go on TV and react to the escape. Pundits have since pointed out that it wasn't just about the money. The government was desperate for the bloody fighting to stop, and it hoped that Chapo would again bring the cartels together with a kind of new Pax Mafiosa, just like that old federation. The same pundit said it was pretty obvious that for a while the only people who got arrested seemed to be El Chapo's enemies, as if the authorities were actually working with the Sinaloa cartel. You can be sure that those enemies were upset about this, believing El Chapo was playing both criminal and informer, which has always been the case with law enforcement and organized crime. As if that wasn't bad enough, El Chapo also had some help from the people who generally don't call themselves criminals or crime fighters. Those were the banks. El Chapo needed to launder hundreds of millions of dollars, and to do that he went through the normal banking system. Investigators would later reveal that he used the American bank Wachovia Bank, now a part of Wells Fargo, and also the largest bank in Europe, HSBC. They both got found out and admitted some wrongdoing, but no one ever went to prison for it. The fines, although large, didn't really make a dent in the bank's profits, and so the authorities and the banks, you could say, both took something from El Chapo's hard-earned blood money. Everyone was a winner besides El Chapo and the folks that suffered the damage from the actual drugs. The war raged on, and more of the same was about to come. El Chapo and the other cartels ratcheted up the violence after he escaped in 2001. Mexico soon started breaking records, with drug murders going through the roof, as well as tens of thousands of people going missing over the years. The violence also started to get a lot more brutal, as you might have seen in those videos involving kneeling men and chainsaws. At this point, there was still a huge bounty on El Chapo's head, and you can be sure when he traveled, he rarely didn't use a bulletproof car. They made some songs about him in Mexico. Now having the status of a legend, it's reported that he'd sometimes roll up at a restaurant with a bunch of armed armed guards and before walking out pay for everyone who was in the restaurant. People would talk about this new cult figure, saying he's here, he's there, he's everywhere. But the authorities had no idea where he was. They looked from one part of Mexico to the other, raiding houses, making arrests, but the elusive El Chapo was like a ghost. Then, in 2004, after a tip-off, the Mexican Air Force gave him a surprise visit when he was having a party at the Sinaloa Ranch. Helicopters flew overhead and men in masks descended to the ground only to discover El Chapo had once again slipped off. Still, some journalists later said that they never actually intended to arrest him. Yet again, they said the authorities needed to look like they were doing a good job fighting the drug war. Almost the same thing happened again later in 2004, but this time the authorities were only about 10 minutes late. They did at least come away from the raid with El Chapo's laptop and some photographs showing that he had been at the ranch and also put on a few pounds. They burned down the ranch and set fire to his cars, which you can be sure appeared on TV for public consumption. And yet again, there were some Mexican journalists saying the whole thing was for show. How come they were always a few minutes late, and how come El Chapo had the escape abilities of the Roadrunner? In 2005, he was seen again, this time eating at a restaurant along with 15 guards brandishing AK-47s. One of El Chapo's men apparently stood up and said to the other eaters, "Gentlemen, please give me a moment of your time. A man is going to come in, the boss. We will ask you to remain in your seats, the doors will be closed, and nobody is allowed to leave. You will also not be allowed to use your cellulars. Do not worry, if you do everything that's asked of you, nothing will happen. Continue eating, and don't ask for your check, the boss will pay. Thank you." El Chapo then arrived and ordered some steak, after which he shook some hands and left. As promised, everyone got a free meal that day. That's the story anyway. Some people believe people said stuff like that just to create some added mythology behind, for some, a Mexican hero. In 2006, the new Mexican president Felipe Calderón assured his people that he would put an end to the violence, declaring a more serious war on drugs using incorruptible forces from the Mexican military. 53,000 people related to the cartels were eventually arrested, but guess what? The Sinaloa cartel was pretty much untouched, with only 1,000 of its members feeling the wrath of the law. Investigations later revealed that Chapo had given some of his own cartel members up and ratted on tons of other cartels after he made a deal with the DEA and Calderón. This help he gave to the U.S. authorities led to that indictment going away in 2008. As these arrests were compelling some U.S. politicians to talk about a significant victory and making El Chapo not very popular with the people he'd given up, cocaine and blood flowed in the streets as it always had done. But now both streams were about to get bigger. Meanwhile, more rumors surfaced that El Chapo had been seen, sometimes in Guatemala or Honduras, or again, showing some largesse in Mexican restaurants. Apparently one time he did that in Juarez, the home of the Juarez cartel, and after they found out, they burned the place to the ground. In 2009, the Mexican government said anyone who gives us information leading to the arrest of El Chapo would receive 30 million Mexican pesos, and at that same time, the U.S. government put a $5 million bounty on his head. That was nothing in the great scheme of things, with experts saying the drug war cost the U.S. $50 billion per year, and hundreds of millions were spent just on catching El Chapo. Later in 2009, El Chapo met with some of his top guys, and according to the documents that were later obtained, he told them that if push came to shove, they had to defend the drug shipments at all costs, even if it meant opening fire on U.S. or Mexican authorities. Some members of the Mexican church said they knew El Chapo was in a town called Guanaceve in northwest of Mexico, a place famous for its gold mines and tasty enchiladas. The Roman Catholic Archbishop Hector Gonzalez said that, to which the president warned him not to speak too loosely if he didn't know the facts. Not long after that, some undercover military officers entered the town, only to be later found dead with a sign on them saying, "You'll never get Chapo." The rumors of his whereabouts persisted, with some saying he was now traveling under a false name as far away as Argentina, Paraguay, and Colombia, even to Europe. The DEA thought that, but said most of the time he hid out like Osama bin Laden in parts of Mexico where the terrain was rough and any sign of helicopters or trucks would be seen from far away. Still, there is evidence that he did travel often, and again to places such as Argentina, Honduras, and Guatemala, and plenty of folks in Mexico from time to time were on the receiving end of a free meal when El Chapo turned up at their favorite eatery. Then on February 21, 2012, after being tipped off by the U.S., Mexican cops again missed El Chapo when they raided a mansion in Los Cabos, Baja California Sur. He had apparently arranged to meet a sex worker there, but after she told him it wasn't a good day for sex, he rescheduled. Cops arrested her, as well as one of El Chapo's chefs and his pilot. It was beginning to look like El Chapo had a crystal ball, but as you know, that was not the case. He flew around in private jets and changed up how he communicated with his men, and it seemed as though they'd never get him. The U.S. even made a secret plan to send in the Navy SEALs, which consisted of sending men in by land and by air, and if they met any resistance from El Chapo's men, their orders were to shoot to kill. It never happened because because the Mexican armed forces didn't like the plan. In 2013, it was rumored that he'd been shot and killed in Guatemala, but this was more nonsense. Even WikiLeaks shared some information saying he was indeed in northern Guatemala, but very much alive. More intelligence said he had been in various hospitals to deal with his diabetes and heart disease, a consequence partly down to him putting on stacks of weight. Then there came a break in the investigation. Dutch cops arrested Jose Rodrigo Arachinga Gamboa, who at the time was the boss of the Sinaloa cartel's assassin squad, Los Antrax. They also got one of El Chapo's top logistics guys, and so now the DEA had a fair bit to go off in terms of how the cartel's communications and movements went. They believed that El Chapo was getting tired of hiding out all the time and was spending more of his time eating out at nice restaurants in Sinaloa's largest city, Culiacan. One time, he'd ordered one of his runners to pick up the meal. That was Hidalgo Arguello, and he was arrested at the restaurant. He led them to El Chapo's ex-wife's house, but when they got there, El Chapo was gone. The Mexican authorities soon tracked a signal coming from what they believed was Chapo's phone, and in time they were breaking down a reinforced door which they believed would finally lead them to their man. Inside this safe house were cameras and monitors, but no El Chapo. What they didn't know at the time was as they'd been trying to bash down that door, El Chapo had used one of his tunnels to escape. He hadn't crawled pretty far by the time they found a bathtub that could be raised using hydraulics. They soon discovered that once raised, there was an opening to a staircase that led to a tunnel. And off they went, moving much faster than the portly gangster. The Mexican Navy were the ones in pursuit in the tunnel. In the streets above was the Mexican Army, and they were out in force. In the air, a U.S. drone was circling around. Not even the great Houdini could have got away from this lot, but all the Navy ended up finding was an end to the tunnel at a river. Little did they know that El Chapo had used a sewage system that took him to a storm drain. There, he and his right-hand man, a former Mexican Armed Forces commando named Hu Ramirez, fled in a vehicle. It was Ramirez's phone that the authorities later picked up via signals, which told them he was now in the city of Mazatlan. The next evening, February 21, 2014, the Mexican Navy, the DEA, the U.S. Marshal Service, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security were in Mazatlan, either hoping to capture El Chapo and Ramirez or at least just get Ramirez. A phone signal led them to the Miramar condominiums, but not the exact room. The first room that was busted open belonged to 2 American tourists, but when they stormed into the room number 401, they found Ramirez armed with an AK-47. He didn't put up a fight. In another room, they found a babysitter and El Chapo's 2 young girls, Mali and Maria. He was in another room with his wife. No shots were fired. El Chapo was roughed up a bit, but he never went for a nearby rifle. El Chapo suddenly just looked like your average father as they marched him past a bowl full of fruit in the kitchen in his $1,200 a month apartment. Finally, they had him, and what an exhaustive and expensive chase it was. You'd hope that this time they wouldn't let him escape again. El Chapo had other ideas. The U.S. authorities were now happy, hailing the capture as one of the most important in the annals of crime history. Attorney General Eric Holder said it was a landmark achievement, adding the criminal activity Guzman allegedly directed contributed to the death and destruction of millions of lives across the globe through drug addiction, violence, and corruption. The U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson was similarly made up, saying on TV, "We congratulate our Mexican partners in this achievement. It was now time to get him back to the U.S. where he could face the music. But first, he had to be transported to the maximum security prison, Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1. His ride was in a Black Hawk helicopter followed by 2 more helicopters. This time, El Chapo was certainly not going to use the prison as an office or a place to make out with one of his hired sex workers. There would be no business meetings and no running about in the yard. His room was barren. He had no contact with other inmates. His family was only allowed to visit him with a judge's approval and only once every 9 days. There was 1 bed, 1 shower, and 1 toilet in a room that was incredibly dingy. Watching his every move was a security camera. It was 23 hours a day like this, and even when he was allowed out, he wasn't allowed to see other prisoners. The officers were even told never to talk to him unless giving him an order. The man, who not long ago appeared on the Forbes rich list as a billionaire, was given a government-approved $48 a month to buy products for personal hygiene. There was no way of getting money in from the outside. His days were spent alone in that cell. That might seem somewhat extrajudicial, but the fear was that Chapo had escaped before, and if he had any chance to wield his massive wealth, he might do it again. The Mexicans filed charges against him relating to drug trafficking and organized crime, while the U.S. was busy filing for extradition. Then, in April 2014, the Attorney General of Mexico dealt a blow to the U.S. when he declared that he wanted El Chapo to face the charges on his home turf. He said he feared the U.S. would grant him some leniency for giving other criminal figures up. As time passed, questions were asked about just how solitary Chapo's confinement was. In July, he and another drug kingpin went went on a hunger strike over the poor conditions in the prison. Something like 1,000 other prisoners joined the strike, but since El Chapo was not supposed to be able to communicate with other prisoners, how did he manage it? The Washington Post wrote, "The world's most fearsome drug lord was now apparently a human rights crusader, but that he had the freedom of movement and communication inside the prison to pull it off." That's a question you need to think about as we head further into this unbelievable story. In September, a U.S. court indicted Chapo for his drug empire and also for using a team of trained assassins to commit hundreds of acts of violence, including murder, assault, kidnapping, assassination, and acts of torture. Those were some pretty serious charges, but again, Chapo's lawyers managed to get an injunction against the extradition on the grounds that under the Mexican Constitution, his rights would be violated in the U.S. It was finally decided that El Chapo should first serve his sentence in Mexico, which would mean dying in a Mexican prison, seeing as his sentence was going to be 300 to 400 years. This was what was going on in July 2015, just over a year since El Chapo had been in prison. No one ever expected him to get out. He would die an old man behind bars. Then, on the evening of July 11th, he was suddenly gone. This time, his Houdini trick would shock the world. No one in history had pulled off anything like this. He'd last been seen by the security cameras at 8:52 p.m. That's when he went to take a shower. The spot where he did that was the only place in his cell that the security cameras couldn't pick up. He seemingly walked into the shower and just disappeared. And when officers went to inspect, he had indeed just vanished. Below the shower, the authorities found a small hole in the ground with PVC piping acting as a ladder. This led down into a tunnel, and not a small tunnel either. It was replete with tracks at the foot of it, and connected to those was a motorcycle that had been adapted to run on the tracks. That bike wasn't so much for a fast getaway for El Chapo, but for the people who'd been doing all that digging down there. It was estimated that the earth that had been removed could have filled up something like 350 trucks, something that would have taken a year using that small bike as transport. About 1 mile from the start of the tunnel was the end, which was inside a half-built house. El Chapo had his people construct something which didn't really make any of the nearby farmers suspicious. They later said that sure, they saw someone building and moving what appeared to be a lot of dirt and sand, but so what? That kind of thing was normal. Seriously, did no one at all in the prison know this was going on? A lot of pundits said someone must have been in on it, and that's likely why El Chapo was able to start that protest in prison. Maybe they said his confinement wasn't exactly what the public had been told. One of those pundits said, "Here's a guy who time and again has proven he could build a hole in the ground. If they're not looking at every single piece of soil around where they have that guy locked up, then they don't have the willingness." Talk about the Mexican authorities having egg on their face. Not to mention the US feeling like some more millions of dollars had gone to waste chasing this man. How had tunnels not been suspected when the authorities knew El Chapo had a thing for building them? The man was like a mole on steroids. Digging was his thing. After his arrest in 2014, they found several tunnels leading from various houses in the city of Culiacan, not to mention all those so-called super tunnels that Cartel had used to get cocaine under the US border. El Chapo was to tunneling what Ted Bundy was to killing, and you'd have never let Bundy alone in a prison cell with a pretty young woman in a hammer lying nearby. Chapo's guys hadn't even rushed the tunnel, making it 2 feet wide and more than 5 feet high, big enough for El Chapo to stroll through rather than crawl and get dirty. It had ventilation inside and was fitted with lights. The only thing missing perhaps was a bar at the end where the diggers could have a beer after a hard day's work. It was a total embarrassment for all involved, with the authorities declaring states of emergency in nearby areas and closing down the closest airport. The chase was on, again, and it was one massive manhunt. As heavily armed cops stopped vehicles all over Mexico State, inside the prison around 30 employees were held back and interrogated. A U.S. professor who wrote about crime trends around the globe told the New York Times, "It's almost Mexico's worst nightmare, and I suspect many in U.S. law enforcement are apoplectic right now." This is exactly why they wanted him extradited. They didn't trust the Mexican prison system to hold the man down, and to think that when the Mexican general attorney announced to the world that El Chapo was not going to be extradited before he served out his time in Mexico, when someone talked about the escape risk, he shrugged it off and said, "It doesn't exist." You won't be surprised to hear he was replaced after El Chapo got away again. Around this time, 7 officials, including 2 members of Mexico's Secret Service and some prison staff, were arrested. 6 others were also put in handcuffs, and prison directors and staff were fired. It's still not clear who helped him escape from the inside, if anyone at all. It might have only been the work of his family and Cartel. To make matters worse for the authorities, soon after El Chapo escaped, a Twitter account bearing his name seemed to taunt those who were after him. Writing in Spanish, he basically told Donald Trump that he could eat his own poop. He also wrote, "Life takes many turns. One day you're in the hole and the next day you're on top." He addressed one tweet to the Mexican president saying, "Don't call me a delinquent because I give people work, unlike you, you cowardly politician." Another tweet said, "Never say never. This world keeps turning. In this life, he who risks nothing cannot win." that certainly enshrouded El Chapo with more legendary status. So you have to ask, how did he manage to get on Twitter so fast? According to the US media, those tweets very likely came from El Chapo's hand. Now, Interpol had been given the warning. Airports were on the lookout for him. Helicopters scoured the skies. Police were stopping cars all over nearby cities and towns. These were desperate times, especially as the days passed and El Chapo didn't turn up. They were so desperate that the Mexican government asked for the help of Colombian officials who'd helped hunt down members of the Cali and Medellin cartels. What no one knew right then was how he'd gotten away, or not the full story anyway. It turned out that once he'd gotten to that half-built house, he'd been taken on the back of an ATV to a warehouse. He was then taken to another city where a private plane picked him up and took him to a hideout in the mountainous area of La Tuna in his state of choice, Sinaloa. And that's where he decided it was time to get more famous and rub shoulders with a Hollywood superstar. El Chapo had first gotten acquainted with celebrities a few years earlier when he was contacted by one of Mexico's most famous actresses, Kate del Castillo. She shocked the world in 2012 when she announced this about the murderous drug kingpin. Today, I believe more in El Chapo Guzman than the governments that hide all the truths. She then wrote a letter to Mr. Chapo. Yeah, she actually addressed him as Mr. Chapo, which stated, "Don't you think it'd be great if you could start trafficking with positive things?" Her answer to his problems and problems at large was that he should start trafficking in love. Now, you'd think El Chapo would have almost choked on his ceviche de sierra when he saw that, but no, it seems he took a liking to her. In 2014, El Chapo's lawyers got in touch with her, and while he was on the run a year later, they talked about making a movie about his life. This is where the actor Sean Penn comes in. Through Castillo, Penn and Chapo got in touch, and the two agreed to meet at Chapo's hideout in the mountains. Sean Penn knew there'd be a certain amount of hood-over-the-head stuff going on, and he understood he was meeting with a very dangerous man, writing, "I'd seen plenty of video and graphic photography of those beheaded, exploded, dismembered, or bullet-riddled innocents, activists, courageous journalists, and cartel enemies alike." When Penn arrived, Chapo told him he was born poor, and he hadn't been given many opportunities in life, even saying he wasn't really a violent man. He also said, "I supply more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world. I have a fleet of submarines, airplanes, trucks, and boats." That communication almost gave him away because the Mexican authorities tracked some signals and proceeded to raid the hideout. He escaped again and got on a helicopter as the authorities were right behind him. They said they didn't shoot because El Chapo was with 2 women and a young girl. The women were his chefs. But now the US authorities were more peeved than ever. This man was now talking to Hollywood stars, for God's sakes, and yet the country had been chasing him around for years and spending many millions of taxpayer dollars to do so. It was then decided another Mexican-American operation would be launched, this time called Operation Black Swan. The US Army's elite counterterrorism unit, Delta Force, wouldn't be involved in any actual raids, but helping by giving tactical advice. The Mexican Navy had heard that at a coastal town in Sinaloa called Los Mochis, armed guards had been spotted at a certain house. They put the house under surveillance, hearing one night, January 8, 2016, someone special was about to arrive. That night, a large order for tacos was placed at a restaurant, enough to please El Chapo and a bunch of bodyguards. They raided the place early in the morning, not really knowing who'd be there, but assuming at least some of Chapo's top men. Cops, the army, and 17 highly trained specialists from Mexico's special forces kicked down a door and opened fire. 5 of Chapo's men were killed there and then. Another 6 were injured compared to one of the Special Forces men. Lying next to the bloodied men was a total of 8 assault rifles, 2 M16s with grenade launchers, 2 Barrett M82 sniper rifles, a loaded RPG, and outside were 2 armored cars. El Chapo, as always, was well hidden, and as soon as he heard the gunshots, he lifted up a mirror that was covering an entrance to another one of his very useful tunnels. Alongside him was his chief assassin, El Cholo Ivan. One tunnel led to another tunnel, and eventually the men got out and attempted to get far away from the scene in a stolen vehicle which they'd held up at gunpoint. Cops all over the state were alerted to the license plate number of the vehicle, and in no time, El Chapo and his sicario were stopped. He offered those cops a huge amount of cash, houses, cushy jobs, anything they wanted, but this time the bribe was rebuffed. El Chapo looked at them and said, "You're all going to die." Those 4 cops on the scene radioed through to their bosses and were told something like 40 assassins were on their way to free El Chapo and his assassin. In no uncertain terms, they were told to go straight to a motel and wait there for the special forces to arrive. They did, and at last, again, El Chapo was in the hands of the authorities. He was taken to Mexico City and flown by helicopter to the prison he'd escaped from, and there he was greeted by some men that wanted a serious chat with him. Yet again, Mexican and US officials praised the great work of both sides and hailed this capture as a great success in the never-ending war on drugs. They didn't say never-ending, but as you'll soon see, getting El Chapo out of the way had virtually no effect on the flow of drugs into the US and around the world. Chapo and his lawyers tried to fight extradition, but this time it did not work. One of the Mexican judges involved with the extradition went out jogging one morning and was assassinated, but it still went through. On January 19, 2017, El Chapo arrived on U.S. soil to great media fanfare. On July 17, 2019, El Chapo was told he'd be serving a life sentence plus 30 years at an American prison. He was also ordered to pay back some of the money he'd earned, which officially was $12,666,181,704. None of that was found, and it's still missing. The question is, could El Chapo actually escape again? We think the answer is a resounding no. He sits in a cell for 23 hours a day in a prison that is located in the middle of nowhere. Even if you could dig a tunnel, you'd be spotted at some point, since there is nothing around for miles. ADX Florence has the most modern surveillance in any prison, which includes sensor pads all over the floors if someone somehow went for a walk around. That will never be possible. Even when Chapo does get out of his cell, he's taken to another roofed area by a 5-man team. That area also doesn't have natural light. As a former official at this prison said, El Chapo's life is now a fate worse than death. El Chapo himself said, "It's been torture, the most inhumane situation I've lived in my entire life. It has been physical, emotional, and mental torture." You won't be surprised to hear that there was another turf war in Mexico after El Chapo became absent, leading to record-breaking murder rates, mostly drug war deaths, in 2017 and 2018. The rate went down somewhat in Mexico as lockdowns hit the world in 2020, but drug abuse went up in many countries as people dealt with the fallout of a deadly virus. And now the U.S. has a new drug trafficking enemy number one in the Jalisco New Generation Cartel's El Mencho. He is one of the most wanted men in the world, with the U.S. now offering a $10 million reward for his capture, as well as Mexico offering a handsome reward. But again, he's just one man in a giant network of mostly formerly poor men who accept the risks of selling drugs when the rewards are so incredibly high. Taking El Chapo out of the mix did nothing at all to reduce drug supply and use in the U.S. and elsewhere, leading one Harvard academic to state, "We are choosing to throw money away to stop something we are never going to stop. So all that bragging and boasting about locking up El Chapo is meaningless." He isn't alone in thinking that, with many experts and media saying the war on drugs has been a catastrophic failure on an unprecedented level in terms of the misery and death it's caused in the wake of not working. The prisons are overflowing, the shootings are still happening, and addicts still die, sometimes from pharmaceutical drugs in the mix. John and Jane from just about any city or town near you can go outside and easily buy a gram bag of this or that. It hardly matters where you are in the world, which is testament to the failures of the war and the veracity of its soldiers. Also, as experts following the war have written, when law enforcement does have some success and puts a leak in the drug pipeline from time to time, it almost always ends with even more extreme violence as products go missing, causes paranoia and chaos. On top of that, Human Rights Watch said a while back that most of the arrests in this war, 80% of them are for possession, not sales or trafficking. And many habitual users do what they do because they need help, not prison, where drugs are usually plentiful. Since the war on drugs started, it's cost over $1 trillion in the US alone. But this industry of misery costs tons of money in just about every country. Nonetheless, just to dismantle the various industries it supports, prison, justice, law enforcement, and many more, would mean disrupting the economy, and also getting tough on drugs has always been a useful tactic for politicians to amass more votes. Still, as the arrest of Mr. Chapo shows, which is just a microcosm of the war on drugs at large, while drugs remain illegal, there's always more El Chapos. We'd like to give you a number as to how many people this war has killed since it started decades ago with that nice guy Mr. President Richard Nixon, but right now, this writer's mind is somewhat boggled. National Geographic says 2.5 million lives have been lost, and you can take it or leave it. Maybe some say the war on drugs is just the best we can do, but if you want to see what would happen if a country did something radical and decriminalized drugs, look no further than Portugal, which in the year 2001 did just that, and decided public health was more important than public order when it came to illicit drugs. Drugs are still there, but things have for the most part changed for the better. Why hasn't the world copied it? Asked one British journalist. Many people now think it's only a matter of time before that happens, because as things stand, the war on drugs makes the grade for how Albert Einstein once described the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Men freeze in place, holding pickaxes and shovels at the ready inside a well-lit tunnel under the Mexican countryside. They can hear the vibrations of a vehicle above them and, wary of making any noise that might give them away, hold their work as the prison patrol passes overhead. 30 feet below the prison's main yard, there's little chance of being discovered. But after several months of secret tunneling, they can't take any chances, especially when they are so close to their goal. The prison cell of Mexico's most famous drug kingpin, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. For months, they've tunneled through solid rock with nothing more than pickaxes and shovels, moving as fast as they can with their limited equipment, but with great caution. The work would go much faster if they could use modern tunnel digging equipment,
like jackhammers and boring machines. But not only would that create noise that might give them away, it would draw a great deal of attention to their staging area, just a mile from the prison perimeter. Prior to tunnel digging, El Chapo's powerful drug cartel purchased a small plot of land as close to the prison as they could get and began constructing 2 small homes as a cover for their real intentions. The homes never made it past a rough brick outer shell though, because of course they would not be inhabited. Instead, they provided the cover needed to start construction on the tunnel that would set El Chapo free. But the tunnel crew was facing incredible pressure to finish as quickly as possible. Due to his history of escaping from prison and evading police raids, Mexican authorities could at any time transfer El Chapo to another prison in order to foil any possible escape attempts. Every day the tunnelers took to get their boss was another day the entire thing could be for nothing, and a new escape attempt in a completely different location would have to be devised. But that's not all. The unfinished buildings were beginning to draw attention from local officials and curious villagers alike. Why would someone start construction on an empty piece of land and then suddenly stop with only a shell of a home built? Time was running out and pressure was mounting. Inside his cell, El Chapo was the model prisoner. Despite his long history of ordering some of the most horrific violence Mexico has ever seen, El Chapo maintained a cordial and even pleasant attitude with his prison guards and fellow inmates. His conversations over the phone were carefully monitored, his mail checked by prison officials, but not a single hint of the ongoing plot was ever revealed. El Chapo was a true professional by now and patient, but his patience was running out. The tunnel diggers faced a daunting task from the start, and they knew they had to move fast. Despite the incredible pressure on them, however, they managed to not only reach El Chapo before any potential prison transfer, but they wound up breaking through to El Chapo's cell just 16 months into his prison stay. The tunnel they constructed was sophisticated, impressing officials who would later remark that a tunnel of that magnitude should have taken 18 months to 2 years to construct. Its walls were reinforced when needed, with wooden paneling, and a generator pumped fresh air through a mile-long ventilation system to keep the tunnel oxygenated. On the ground, the tunnelers had laid down rails and used a motorcycle to shuttle 2 carts, which were filled with dirt back and forth along the shaft. Once El Chapo was reached, he would ride on that same motorcycle and quickly shuttle the mile distance to freedom. All that dirt, though, had to go somewhere, and so the tunnelers cleverly transferred it to the tunnel opening, where others would spread the dirt around on the field outside, rather than dump it in giant piles, which would no doubt draw attention. Still, the presence of fresh dirt littering acres of empty fields was sure to eventually draw attention, and questions that would not be easy to answer for the fake construction crew above ground. Suddenly though, in the middle of the night on July 12, 2015, the sound of metal scraping came from El Chapo's shower inside his cell. Moments later, the ceramic bottom of the shower popped free, and a friendly face greeted the imprisoned drug lord, beckoning him into the darkness below. Wasting no time, El Chapo ducked into the secret tunnel, climbing down 30 feet into a tunnel only as wide across as a man, but just tall enough for El Chapo to stand upright. Often derided for his short stature by his enemies, the tunnel diggers had made sure that the tunnel was just tall enough so the boss wouldn't have to hunch as he walked along it. A classy prison escape if we ever heard of one. A few feet into the mouth of the tunnel, El Chapo boarded a small motorcycle which had been affixed to metal tracks. The carts full of dirt that had pushed along for months now were gone, and just moments after leaving his cell, El Chapo was cruising along the well-lit tunnel like a kid on an amusement park ride. 2 minutes later, El Chapo ended his joyride by climbing up wooden steps and popping up into the empty shell of a home his crew had been secretly working from for a year and a half. Changing into clean clothes, El Chapo then climbed onto a truck and whisked away into the dark of the night, leaving behind an incredible mile-long secret tunnel and completely frustrated prison system and Mexican government both. El Chapo would be caught again just months after his escape, after his newest safe house was given away weeks before his arrival by careless gunmen who were spotted by locals. Responding to reports of heavily armed men, Mexican officials put the house under surveillance and intercepted communications saying that grandma or aunt was coming to visit. Realizing this had to be a high-value target, officials waited for their chance to strike. 1 month later, Mexican Special Forces soldiers raided the home and killed several bodyguards, but El Chapo and one of his most senior lieutenants escaped via, you guessed it, a secret tunnel. Popping up a mile from the home, the two stole a vehicle at gunpoint, though the driver immediately reported it to the police. After issuing an alert for the stolen vehicle, the federal police officers discovered the stolen car and placed the two fugitives under arrest. El Chapo, however, wouldn't go without at least trying to buy his freedom. Knowing how easily corruptible public officials had been in the past, El Chapo bribed the police officers, offering them money, homes, and even lucrative jobs if they let him go. Little did the desperate Kingpin know, however, that he was dealing with a brand new brand of Mexican police officer, one not as easily corrupted as his predecessors. All four officers refused El Chapo, after which his offers of honey turned into vinegar, telling the police officers that they were all going to die. The four officers sent pictures to El Chapo to their superiors, only to be warned that the police had received a tip-off that 40 heavily armed assassins were en route to free El Chapo. With friendly forces still tied up at the compound, the officers were ordered to a nearby motel on the outskirts of town, where they holed themselves up in an empty room and prepared for a possible shootout for their lives. All the while, El Chapo laughed, echoing his previous threats. Suddenly, a convoy of vehicles lit up the roadside, clearly headed for the lonely motel. The officers, armed with M16 assault rifles and pistols, prepared for what was surely their last stand. El Chapo taunted them, telling them they were about to face death, and after them, their families. Yet the officers held their ground, ready to die for duty's sake if need be. As the vehicles began to turn into the parking lot, however, El Chapo's taunts died in his throat. Once the glare of the headlights faded, the barricaded officers could see military trucks full of Mexican Marines rushing to take up defensive positions around the motel. Minutes later, a thoroughly defeated and dejected-looking El Chapo was dragged into an SUV and rushed off to an airfield. El Chapo would not escape from Mexican prison again, and 2 years later, any hope of ever escaping again would be extinguished as Mexico approved an extradition request to the United States. Safely in U.S. custody, El Chapo faces life in prison, and though he may have been one of the deadliest men in Mexico's history, the drug kingpin would ultimately be remembered as nothing more than a sobbing mess as he begged U.S. justice officials for leniency, which they would not grant.
El Chapo, the notorious drug lord who in 2015 topped the list of the world's most wanted men for the second time, managed to evade authorities for decades. Even when he was caught, dramatic escapes and the incomprehensible ability to keep his narcotics empire running while imprisoned allowed him to amass a net worth of at least $1 billion. But finally, a pair of captures spearheaded by the Mexican Navy seem to have imprisoned him for good. How did they manage to take him down? The answer goes back decades before they went down. Born either in 1954 or 1957 as Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo rose to prominence as the founder of the Sinaloa Cartel. From 1989 onward, that cartel became one of the most powerful drug trafficking rings in the world. Sadly, a life of crime seemed to be his destiny from the start. El Chapo's early years were marred by poverty and the outburst of his abusive father, a man who himself was in the drug trade, and would often take out his aggression on El Chapo and his mother. By the time he was in his teens, the boy who would become El Chapo had already been booted out of the family home and was left to fend for himself. He would soon follow in his father's footsteps. Desperate for money, Guzman started selling marijuana on the streets of Mexico. Throughout the 1970s, he embarked on a slow rise that saw him go from street pusher to a key trafficker within his home district of Sinaloa. He wasn't anywhere near being the kingpin he would become just yet, but by the time he reached his late 20s, El Chapo was working with a man who would prove the key in this later era of drug dominance. That man was Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the founder of the Guadalajara cartel, which trafficked cocaine into the United States and was generating an estimated $5 billion a year by the 1980s. Gallardo took the young El Chapo under his wing. El Chapo learned from his boss, though he wisely kept a low profile during this period. That would change in 1985 when Gallardo was arrested, following the murder of a Drug Enforcement Administration or DEA agent in the United States. Gallardo went on trial for murder and drug trafficking charges, receiving a 40-year sentence. With Gallardo gone, there was a vacuum in his territory, a vacuum El Chapo was all too eager to fill. 4 years after Gallardo was sent down, El Chapo founded the Sinaloa Cartel, inheriting some of his boss's old territory in the process. Creativity was the driving force behind El Chapo's success. He found ever more inventive ways to smuggle cocaine into the U.S., with the most impressive being a series of tunnels that ran underneath the border between Mexico and the U.S. Those tunnels could be as deep as 70 feet underground and were often built tall and wide enough for an adult to walk or ride through them while carrying their shipment of drugs. For every one of those tunnels the DEA closed, El Chapo found another way to sneak his drugs into the U.S. Other novel methods ranged from the simple, such as putting drugs in cans that were labeled as chili peppers, to the ingenious. One method saw El Chapo stash cocaine powder within fire extinguishers that were shipped from Mexico to the U.S. Given that dry powder fire extinguishers already contained a powder, it wasn't much work for El Chapo and his crew to substitute the legitimate chemical compound with his drugs to get them past airport security. And El Chapo's organization kept on growing. By the 1990s, it was sending cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamine to 5 continents, making it the largest international drug operation in the world. El Chapo also benefited from the fading of the Colombian cartels that had been so prominent in the 1970s and 1980s. As Cali and Medellin started to wane, El Chapo took on more territory. He also became more vicious. Within the Sinaloa cartel, he began forming gangs: Los Texas, Los Lobos, Los Negros, Los Chachos, and several more, all operated somewhat autonomously, though with the collective goal of growing the cartel boss's empire. The men who joined those gangs have been accused of collectively committing over 1,000 murders in Mexico alone, likely with many more in other countries, alongside untold casualties caused by fighting with other cartels. This level of activity couldn't go unnoticed for long. Despite his efforts to keep a low profile, El Chapo found himself on the radars of both the DEA and the FBI in the early 1990s. However, neither would be successful in capturing the drug lord. Instead, El Chapo was first captured in 1993 by the Guatemalan army while relaxing at a hotel in Tapachula, Guatemala. He was handed over to the Mexican authorities 2 days later and sent back to his home country for trial. He was initially imprisoned at the Federal Social Rehabilitation Center No. 1, also known as La Palma, with his trial seeing the drug lord receiving Mexico's maximum prison sentence of 20 years and 9 months for the crimes of drug trafficking, bribery, and criminal association. More convictions would follow. In 1995, El Chapo was transferred to the Federal Center for Social Rehabilitation II, or Puente Grande, where he was convicted of several other crimes, including drug trafficking and possession of firearms. He was also tried for the murder of Cardinal Ocampo, though the judge dismissed that charge and Chapo would serve no time for it. That should have been the end of his story, but it was just the beginning. El Chapo somehow kept on finding ways to keep running his empire from behind bars. He was generous with his bribes to the guards, through which he was able to arrange conjugal visits and meetings with cartel members to keep his operations running. That alone would have been embarrassing enough for Mexico were it not for another issue, which is that El Chapo was becoming a legend in his own country. Many of the villagers in his home district of Sinaloa saw him as a Robin Hood-esque figure who had risen from poverty to become the most famous man the region had ever produced. It also can't escape mention that El Chapo's drug exploits poured money into Sinaloa. He gave jobs, however illegitimate, to hundreds of men, helping them climb out of the very poverty that the drug lord had experienced himself. To them, he wasn't just a crazed mass murderer, he was a legend. And that legend only grew when El Chapo carried out his first escape in 2001. The story goes that El Chapo had bribed a host of prison guards and employees to enable his escape from Puente Grande. One of those guards was Francisco Camberos Rivera, also known as El Chito, or the Silent One. He was responsible for opening El Chapo's cell door and ushering him into a laundry cart. El Chito pushed El Chapo down the strangely unguarded hallways of the prison, coming to a set of electronic doors that had been opened by another guard. Those doors led into a parking lot where El Chapo moved from the laundry cart into the trunk of a Chevrolet Monte Carlo before being driven away. There was just one guard on duty in the parking lot at the time. Though some dispute the account, it is certain that he received inside help. Following his escape, a federal investigation into Puente Grande led to the arrests of 71 of the prison's employees, with the warden even falling under suspicion. El Chapo didn't care. He was out and free to continue running his cartel from the outside. This period of freedom brought renewed violence to the Sinaloa region. According to Forbes, the annual tally of murders in the region was around 400 in 2007. Likely due to a need to reassert its dominance, El Chapo's cartel started killing rivals and others. The murder rate rose to around 750 in 2008, just under 1,500 in 2009, and finally reached a peak of just under 2,500 by 2010. El Chapo was back, and his cartel was more dangerous than ever. Between 2001 and 2013, El Chapo increased his security enormously. He was shadowed by an entourage of armed guards at all times, practically being treated like a head of state during a visit to another country. He used part of his billion-plus dollar fortune to buy bulletproof vehicles, private airplanes, and even all-terrain vehicles that he could use to conduct a quick escape if the authorities ever got too close. With all of this investment into his own security, El Chapo seemed confident in his ability to evade authorities. Eyewitness accounts even claimed that he would often walk into restaurants with his gunmen, ordering everybody to turn off their cell phones so he could enjoy a meal. He got away with it and grew his legend because he would then pay the tabs of everybody in the restaurant. But El Chapo was growing overconfident. By 2013, Mexico's security forces were already working on another plan to capture him. That year saw him penetrate his inner circle, resulting in the arrests of several of his top lieutenants, including Mario Nunez, a former Sinaloa cartel member believed to be complicit in at least 350 murders ordered by El Chapo. Combining these captures with information from wiretaps, tips from informants, and the occasional confession, Mexican authorities were slowly getting closer to figuring out the cartel boss's whereabouts. In 2014, they finally had a location, but just sending law enforcement after him would not be enough. No, now it was time for the Mexican Navy to come into play. For the 13 years since El Chapo's escape, he had become a top target for both Mexico and the United States, to the point where the U.S. was offering a $5 million reward for any information that led to his capture. Ultimately, it wouldn't need to make a payout. On February 12, 2014, the Procuraduría General de la República, or PGR, captured a high-ranking Sinaloa cartel chief named Daniel Fernandez Dominguez, also known as El Pelacas. El Pelacas didn't talk, but that didn't matter because he was carrying something that gave the Mexican Navy all the info they needed: 20 cell phones filled with contacts for the PGR to investigate. Many of the contacts had numbers that used the Sinaloa dialing code, with investigators quickly concluding that at least some of those contacts would be cartel associates of El Pelacas. More raids followed. A day after the capture of El Pelacas, the PGR, Mexican Federal Police, and the Mexican Navy conducted a joint raid that led to the arrest of Joel Enrique Sandoval Romero, otherwise known as El-19. It was another huge capture as El-19 was believed to have murdered a security chief working for El Chapo's rival, El Mayo. However, El-19 wouldn't break. Instead, it was one of the 4 associates who were arrested alongside him that gave the Mexican authorities the info they needed. One of the cell phones they were carrying belonged to El Chapo. More traces followed. On February 16, 2014, American authorities were able to use the data that Mexico's authorities had gathered to track down El Condor, real name Carlos Manuel Ju Ramirez. El Condor was El Chapo's chief of communications, and through him came more information. The US and Mexico discovered the names of other facilitators in the Sinaloa cartel, along with a stash house located in Mexico. But the biggest discovery was that of the phone number of Mario Hidalgo Arguello, a bodyguard and personal assistant to El Chapo who went by the alias El Nariz and was a key part of the drug lord's inner circle. Mexico finally had the man it needed to lead them to El Chapo. Just hours after tracing El Nariz's location, authorities swooped in on his home in Culiacan. He was arrested on his doorstep after returning from picking up dinner for El Chapo at a local restaurant, after which he was quickly taken into custody. El Nariz broke. He told the authorities everything he knew, including information about El Chapo's whereabouts in Culiacan and several addresses where the cartel boss may be. All of that information was passed to the Mexican Navy, which tasked its Marines with conducting the raids that would bring El Chapo to justice. The first of those raids took place on February 17, 2014. Mexico's finest raided a property in the Colinas de San Miguel neighborhood that belonged to El Chapo's ex-wife. They didn't find their target, though they destroyed several of the drug kingpin's belongings during the raid. But they weren't too worried. El Nariz had already told them that El Chapo rarely spent more than a day at a single address, and they had several more on their list to investigate. Still, it seemed like the Mexican Navy wouldn't need all of those addresses because El Chapo had made a critical mistake just before dawn on the day they raided his ex-wife's home. He had turned on his cell phone. El Chapo made a brief but desperate call to someone he hoped would help get him out of Culiacan before the Mexican Navy descended upon him. That call was tracked and led the Mexican Navy to a house in Libertad, but there was a problem. The door wouldn't budge no matter how much the Navy pounded on it. Later, it was found that the door was not only reinforced using steel, but that it had been custom-made to have water on the inside, which would prevent the door from breaking down due to the Mexican heat. It took the Navy 10 minutes to finally break it down, after which they entered only to find there was nobody there. But there was a clue, a bathtub that had been raised using hydraulic lifts. Under that tub lay stairs into a hidden underground passage. The Mexican Navy had missed El Chapo by mere minutes. The Marines sent to storm the building quickly started making their way through the hidden tunnel, only to find that it opened up into the Culiacan sewer system. Above ground, troops flooded the streets to block exits out of the region and prevent El Chapo from escaping on foot. A U.S. drone was also deployed, which started scanning manholes so it could alert the Navy if El Chapo emerged from any of them. In the sewers, the Navy discovered a tactical vest on one of the many paths they could take, following it until they reached a storm drain that led out into a river 1 mile away from the house they'd raided. The Navy had lost the trail, and El Chapo had escaped once again. Still, the net was closing around the drug lord. Soon after the failed raid, Mexican authorities captured El Picudo, also known as Mario Lopez Osorio. El Picudo detailed how El Chapo made his escape. He exited the storm drain that the Navy discovered and was picked up in a vehicle by El Picudo. Aides met them driving south out of Culiacan, where El Chapo switched vehicles before being transported to another location. For a moment, it would have felt like El Chapo was out of the Navy's grasp, were it not for one key detail. He had been accompanied during his escape by a bodyguard named Joel Ramirez. Another raid followed, this time on Ramirez's home, but it came up empty. But then another fortunate breakthrough. On February 20th, 2014, Ramirez turned on his BlackBerry cell phone to send a text to a fellow cartel member. Mexican authorities caught and tracked that signal, which led them to the Sinaloa resort of Mazatlan. The Mexican Marines believed that they may have missed their chance, thinking that El Chapo had already escaped to Sierra Madre in all the confusion. Still, they decided to conduct a raid on the hotel, to which the signal led them anyway. If nothing else, they might capture Joel Ramirez and get one step closer to El Chapo. They ended up getting a lot more than a bodyguard. As the evening drew close on February 21, 2014, 40 members of the Mexican Navy converged on Mazatlan. They weren't alone. American agents from the U.S. Marshal Service, Department of Homeland Security, and DEA linked up with the Marines, with all working together to pinpoint Ramirez's location, the Hotel Miramar. The problem was that the hotel was a 12-story building containing dozens of rooms in which Ramirez and possibly El Chapo might be hiding. Knowing these variables could lead to another escape if they weren't careful, the Marines descended on the building on February 22nd, cordoning it off before entering to quiz the staff. There, they discovered that 2 rooms had been rented out the previous day. One of those rooms had to contain Ramirez. The Marines divided into 2 teams, with one making its way to the 6th floor of the hotel to storm one of the 2 rooms. No Ramirez, just a pair of American tourists who awoke to the sights and sounds of half a dozen soldiers. At the same time, another team of 6 Marines made their way to the 4th floor, and apartment 401. Jackpot! Ramirez was standing outside of the door armed with an AK-47 rifle. There was no dramatic shootout as Ramirez surrendered his weapon without a fight. But wait a second, if Ramirez was standing outside of the door, that would suggest somebody was with him. Was El Chapo in the apartment? The Marines stormed the room, discovering El Chapo's personal chef and babysitter in one of the bedrooms, along with his 2 children, Maria and Molly. In the other bedroom was the target they had spent so long and so many failed operations trying to catch. El Chapo was in the room with his wife, with both surrendering without the Navy having to fire a shot. Within 3 minutes of the raid beginning, El Chapo was under arrest. The Mexican Navy had its man. By the time of El Chapo's dramatic arrest, the Sinaloa cartel was believed to be operating in 50 countries. The American Attorney General, Eric Holder, hailed his capture as a landmark achievement, noting that El Chapo's criminal activities had affected the lives of millions of people around the world, not only due to drug addiction, but the violence and corruption that allowed his cartel to prosper. El Chapo was sent to Altiplano prison. There, he would await trial that would likely sentence him to spend the rest of his life in prison. However, the elusive escape artist had one more trick up his sleeve, and he knew the prison, which was 55 miles west of Mexico City, was vulnerable. Besides, he'd escaped from a high-security facility before. As Mexico's Navy, along with most major American law enforcement bureaus, celebrated El Chapo's arrest, the crime lord was plotting another daring escape. That escape would take place on July 11, 2015. At 8:52 p.m. that day, an alert blared out at Altiplano prison. It had been roughly 50 minutes since the prison guards had seen El Chapo. The last sighting was when the drug lord received his daily medicine before heading back to his cell, and he was no longer visible on the prison's internal security cameras. Guards headed down to El Chapo's cell to find nothing, except a small opening in the shower area. Measuring about 2 square feet, the opening held a ladder made using PVC piping that was roughly the same size as El Chapo, 5 feet 6 inches. The drug lord had climbed down the ladder into a tunnel that extended for about a mile underground. As investigators followed that trail, they discovered a motorbike adapted to roll on rails that they believe El Chapo's henchmen had used to transport tools as they built the tunnel. The tunnel ended at a half-finished house in a construction site a mile away from Altiplano. In that home, investigators found another tunnel that was roughly the same size as the one in El Chapo's cell. Through that tunnel, the drug lord had once again escaped and was free to conduct his business. Another inquest was held, with 18 of the guards at Altiplano being quizzed to find out if they were culpable in the escape, and a new manhunt was underway. This time, the Mexican Navy wouldn't have to wait years to get their man. El Chapo managed to spend 6 months on the run before he was tracked to the northwestern city of Los Mochis, thanks to a tip received from an anonymous civilian. Working in tandem with several U.S. agencies, just as they had when they captured the drug lord in Mazatlan, the Navy created a plan they dubbed Operation Black Swan. El Chapo would be captured dead or alive. At 4:40 a.m. on January 8, 2016, 17 elite units of Mexico's Marines converged on 1002 Jiquilpan Boulevard, the house in which El Chapo had been staying, according to the tip. They chose this time because they believed the drug lord would be sleeping, with his guards also likely to be tired after a long night of keeping watch. They wouldn't be prepared for what was about to come. A signal is given, and the Marines storm the house. They're confronted by about a dozen cartel gunmen, collectively armed with 50 caliber machine guns and a grenade launcher. Those gunmen provide no match for the Marines. A firefight ensues, leaving 5 of the cartel members dead. GoPro footage is later released on the Mexican TV show Primero Noticias, showing the Marines in action, moving from room to room and unleashing hails of bullets and grenades whenever they encounter a threat. Not all of those encountered died at the hands of the Marines. After clearing the downstairs portion of the house, the Marines moved upstairs and began clearing more rooms. They found 2 men in one of the rooms, with both being taken into custody. A sweep of the bathroom revealed 2 women lying on the floor. One of those women was the same chef who had been in the hotel with El Chapo when he was captured in 2014. Again, both were arrested. After about 15 minutes of fighting, the house was under the Marines' control. After all was said and done, the Mexican Marines had discovered a weapons cache containing a pair of M16 rifles with grenade launchers, a loaded rocket-propelled grenade launcher, and 2 Barrett M82 anti-material rifles. Fortunately for the Marines, El Chapo's henchmen hadn't been able to get to the cache before they were taken out. But there was a problem. They still hadn't found El Chapo. With the fighting having died down, the Marines quickly deduced that El Chapo must have been hiding in the only bedroom found on the first floor, the only room the Marines hadn't been able to enter as it had been barricaded. The Marines got to work removing furniture and pounding away at the door, finding several hidden doors along the way. Before they finally entered the room, they discovered El Chapo was still living in luxury even while on the run. The bedroom contained several bags from high-end clothing stores, bread, empty cookie wrappers, and a king-sized bed. The Marines also found medicine, including antibiotics, cough syrup, and, strangely, injectable testosterone. Further investigation of the house discovered El Chapo had equipped it with flat-screen TVs and an internet connection. A DVD box set of La Reina del Sur, a Mexican telenovela, lay on the bed. That little detail is interesting because the star of that show, Kate Del Castillo, had reportedly been in talks with El Chapo to take part in creation of a film chronicling the drug lord's life, but still, no El Chapo. Then, the breakthrough. The search of the bedroom revealed a mirror containing a light fixture. Within that fixture lay a handle. Once activated, it opened a secret door in the bedroom that led down into yet another escape tunnel. El Chapo was once again prepared for the Marines and had used tunnels he favored so much when transporting drugs to evade them. Following the tunnels revealed that they led down into the Los Mochis sewer system. For a moment, all felt lost. After all, El Chapo had another 20-minute head start on the Marines, as they'd spent 15 minutes clearing the house and another 5 breaking into and searching the Kingpin's bedroom. El Chapo had escaped once again, but his glory would be short-lived. Surveillance footage showed El Chapo and one of his lieutenants emerging from a manhole nearby, from which they quickly stole 2 cars so they could flee. Those thefts would be their undoing, as one of the carjacking victims called the police, allowing Mexico's Marines to track that car that El Chapo used in his getaway. Reports vary on what happened next. ABC News, reporting on the account delivered by Primero Noticias, said that El Chapo and his lieutenant were stopped by the Mexican Federal Police on a highway as they attempted to escape the city. The 4 officers who made the arrest, about 12 miles outside of Los Mochis, were informed that 40 cartel assassins were on their way to free El Chapo. The drug lord had even attempted to bribe the officers with cash, homes, and jobs, only to tell them they are all going to die for their role in the arrest. The officer's superiors told them to avoid the counterattack by taking El Chapo to the Dos Motel, with the Mexican Navy arriving to take the 58-year-old drug lord to the Los Mochis airport so he could be transferred to a holding facility in Mexico City. Time magazine offers a different account. It claims that after the owner of the hijacked car contacted police, the Mexican Marines tracked El Chapo to a nearby hotel. The drug lord must have felt like he'd escaped once again, only for the Marines to bust into his hotel room, where they forced the filthy and exhausted cartel boss to surrender by gunpoint. Either way, El Chapo was once again in custody. This time, the Mexican and U.S. authorities decided that El Chapo needed to be incarcerated outside of his home country. He was extradited to the U.S. to stand trial. On July 17, 2019, he finally received his sentence: life in prison plus 30 years to run consecutively to the life sentence on charges that included 26 drug-related offenses and a murder conspiracy. El Chapo would also have to pay $12.6 billion in forfeitures, meaning every asset he owned would be seized while he served time. El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel empire was shattered. The drug lord is now imprisoned at ADX Florence in Colorado, but his story hasn't ended yet.
Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. You've probably heard the name before, but what do you really know about this man who's gone down in modern history as one of the biggest drug kingpins? Number 50. Let's start with some personal details. On April 4, 1957, he was born in a place called La Tuna in Sinaloa, Mexico. This is just a small rural community, the home of what you might call simple farmers. His father was a cattle rancher, although unofficially, he grew opium. Number 49. As for how life was, well, it was tough. Joaquin was the eldest child of the family. He had 4 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters, although he had other siblings that died young. When he was in 3rd grade, he dropped out of school, which left him functionally illiterate for the rest of his life. If you're wondering what functionally illiterate means, it basically is being able to read and write a bit, but not enough to work in most jobs. His writing skills weren't even good enough to pen simple letters, which is why he had people write love letters for him when he was in prison. We'll talk about those later. Number 48. El Chapo sold oranges and candies as a kid to earn extra money. His mother once said about her young son, even as a little child he had ambitions. His sister Bernarda said back in those days he'd always been able to make some cash. Then he'd buy a bunch of fake gold jewelry and show it off while visiting family members. Number 47. When El Chapo was still a young kid, he used to save little pieces of paper that he'd cut into the shapes of bills. He'd get a wad and tie it with a band, pretending it was real money. His mom later said he'd count and recount them and then tie up the little piles. Ever since he was little, he'd always had hopes. He told his mom to save the papers for him and hide them from his father, who, as you'll now see, was not exactly a good influence on the kids. Number 46. With the nearest school being about 60 miles away, El Chapo had little chance of getting any kind of education in his teens. Instead, he grew opium with his pop, but his pop would sell the stuff and usually spend all the earnings on booze and women. Number 45. He started working for his uncle, Pedro Aviles Perez. This guy was one of the first agricultural entrepreneurs to realize a lot of cash could be made by sending drugs over the border to the USA. He cultivated both opium and marijuana and is said to be one of the first people to use planes to get weed over the border. He was shot and killed by a Mexican federal cop in 1978, likely set up by an up-and-coming trafficker. Such was the life. As you'll see, drug kingpins tend to stab each other in the back. Number 44. El Chapo then started working for Hector Luis Palma Salazar. Just to give you an idea of the environment these guys worked in, Salazar's wife and children were murdered by a rival. More bloodshed followed, of course, but let's stick with El Chapo for now, who was no stranger to violence. Number 43. Maybe he had a little man complex because he was always trying to impress when he was coming up in those days. He had to win at any cost. During those early days of smuggling, he had one very simple rule if you worked for him. That was, lose the drugs and you will die. He meant it too, shooting men who had messed up a shipment. Even if someone decided to buy drugs at a lower price, not from him, That could end with them getting shot in the head. He ruled by fear, and it worked for him, which impressed the higher-ups in the Mexican drug world. It's how he came onto the radar of the boss of bosses, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Number 42. Also known as the Godfather, Gallardo was one of the guys that started the powerful Guadalajara cartel. This man had a lot of political connections. He was almost untouchable, and with his contacts in Colombia, he sent an unprecedented amount of cocaine over the border to the US. He set up something called the Federation, which consisted of various branches or plazas of Mexican gangs. Each of these criminal gangs got all the drugs they wanted, but just as important, they received the protection of corrupt cops and politicians that Gallardo had in his pocket. Basically, because U.S. drug enforcement had been very good at clamping down on trafficking by Colombia's Medellin and Cali cartels, the Colombians decided to let the Mexicans do much of the trafficking. This is how weed-exporting farmers turned into giant criminal enterprises. We can't say these were peaceful times, but the Federation days were certainly better than what was to come. Back in those days, El Chapo and Ismael Zambada Garcia were given control of the Pacific Coast operations. This would later become known as the Sinaloa Cartel. Now you'll see how arrests create power vacuums and how they lead to violence. Number 41. Gallardo got arrested. In 1985, DEA agent Enrique Kiki Carmena Salazar was kidnapped. He was tortured and then killed. This was revenge for the destruction of millions of dollars worth of weed. The DEA launched a massive investigation after that, concluding that the Mexican officials and politicians had been working with the narcos. Gallardo was seen as the man behind it all and responsible for the DEA agent's death. Now the Federation didn't have a leader, and El Chapo saw an opportunity. Number 40. From October till May 1987, El Chapo moved 4,400 pounds of weed and about 10,400 pounds of cocaine to the U.S. He made about $1.5 million, most of which he sent back home to Sinaloa. He was just getting started, but the people from where he came felt the cash injection. They would soon begin to refer to him as Robin Hood. Number 39. In 2020, new reports surfaced that the relatives of El Chapo were handing out much-needed food parcels to the people in Sinaloa. El Chapo's face was printed on the packages. In fact, right after he started making the big money, some of it went to fund hospitals, clinics, and schools. He even helped build roads and other infrastructure. He wasn't the first to do this. Pablo Escobar had done it, as had the heroin trafficker from Burma, Kun Sa. Before you get all teary-eyed, just listen to what else El Chapo was capable of. Number 38. The story comes from a former bodyguard of El Chapo, Isaias Valdez Rios. He said that when El Chapo was in hiding, one day he got a telephone call. His men had captured some guys that worked for a rival cartel. After he put down the phone, El Chapo said, "They're sending us a gift." When they got the gift, 3 men, El Chapo beat them with his own hands. He broke their bones with a large stick. Finally, he shot the men and had their bodies burned. The same bodyguard said his boss also had a man buried alive. For being a bodyguard, he was paid just $175 a week. He said that while there was sporadic violence, most of the time he just sat around sending and receiving messages on his phone. He told the court, "Sometimes I hardly ate, even when Mr. Joaquin would rest in his cabin. I would try to sort of rest, but I'd have a small radio with me and he'd say, 'Memin, what did so-and-so say? Memin, say this to so-and-so.' Still, he said another day on the job might mean being part of a hit squad and executing someone." Number 37. Before El Chapo got to be the biggest drug lord in Mexico, he was renowned for being able to get drugs across the border. Those not close to him were often not sure how he did it. One of the reasons for his success was the tunnels he and his men built. They were the best tunnels around, better than anything the other narcos had constructed. In later life, such tunnels would come to El Chapo's rescue. We'll talk more about that later. Number 36. He also sent cocaine across the U.S. in tins of chilies. The brand name was La Comadre. According to news reports, he smuggled $500 million of cocaine that way. 55% of the money went to the Colombian gangs that sent over the cocaine, and the rest went to El Chapo and his men. We're not sure how much the grunts got, but they got really high since the cocaine filled the air where they did the packaging. Number 35. One of his tunnels ran from a house in Mexico and stretched to a house in Douglas, Arizona. To get to the door of the tunnel, a pool table needed to be lifted by hydraulics. Number 34. The cops found that tunnel, but none of El Chapo's men ever went back to it. That's because he was tipped off by a police chief named Guillermo Gonzalez Calderoni. He received millions of dollars from El Chapo. Number 33. Once the Federation was no more, the boys from Sinaloa got into a war with the Tijuana cartel. This led to lots of blood spilled on both sides of the war. El Chapo narrowly escaped being assassinated more than once. Number 32. One time, El Chapo's men got into a gunfight with their enemy in a disco. Both sides fired over 1,000 rounds. Not surprisingly, people died, 6 in total. Number 31.
On May 24, 1993, gunmen from the Tijuana cartel thought they had their man. They were told El Chapo was hiding in a car at Guadalajara International Airport. Around 20 men filled the car with bullets, but El Chapo was in another car. As for the occupants of the wrong car, one of them was the Cardinal and Archbishop of Guadalajara, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. 6 other people were killed too. El Chapo heard the gunfire and was able to sneak off just in time. Number 30. It was this murder of innocent people that made El Chapo a household name in Mexico. Only then was his face on the front of newspapers. It is after the assassination of Cardinal Posada that authorities began to tell us there are big drug lords, and that one of them is named Joaquin Guzman Loera, alias El Chapo Guzman, one investigator later said. Number 29. The Catholic Church in Mexico disagreed, saying it was an execution gone wrong. It said the shooters knew exactly what they were doing. Cardinal Juan Sandoval Inez said forensic evidence pointed to it. He said the assassinated cardinal had been outspoken about how some high-ranking politicians were a bit too close to organized crime. He believed the hit was a conspiracy, which was perhaps one reason why El Chapo got away so easily. Number 28. Still, he was a wanted man after the airport shooting. He hid for a while, likely with the help of corrupt officials. He also handed $200 million to one of his men for the running of the Sinaloa cartel. If he should get arrested, he gave the same amount to another man, money to take care of his family. Number 27. On June 9, 1993, El Chapo was picked up close to Guatemala-Mexico border by the Guatemalan army. He was subsequently sentenced to over 20 years in prison for drug trafficking and other offenses. When asked if he was a drug trafficker, he said, "I'm a farmer." As you'll now see, prison didn't set him back so much. Number 26. He was treated like royalty in the prison, with the guards acting as his very own servants. He not only got what he wanted in there, but he was able to manage the cartel along with his brother Arturo. We won't mention Arturo again, but we will tell you he was eventually shot and killed. Number 25. El Chapo certainly had his hands full during his wars with his enemies. But according to one former narco who talked with Newsweek, the U.S. authorities helped him and his cartel out quite a lot. That's because El Chapo was allegedly acting as an informant for the DEA, telling the agency about his enemies' trafficking routes and where they were about to send something over to the U.S. He also filled agents in as to who had killed who. According to this narco, he'd personally go and visit U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and start talking to agents, who, he said, were always very polite. He told Newsweek one of the ICE agents said they were here to help the Sinaloa cartel. That might sound strange, but that's how the war on drugs has been fought all over the world for a long time. The book Drug War: The Secret History details how law enforcement in the US and the UK had many secret informants. The downside for the authorities is traffickers have manipulated the agencies. A professor at the University of Texas said the Sinaloa cartel was duping US agencies into fighting its enemies. Even worse, when hitman and gangster Juan Carlos Ramirez testified in the US, he told the court that El Chapo bribed corrupt DEA agents with prostitutes, gifts, and apartments. Number 24. El Chapo's lawyer, Humberto Loya Castro, also gave information about other cartels to U.S. law enforcement. It was heard in court that U.S. authorities agreed not to go after El Chapo or any other member of the cartel in return for information. They were also allowed to carry on with their trafficking business. Number 23. His empire only grew while he was in prison, perhaps helped somewhat because he was informing on his rivals. Still, after serving around 8 years, he wanted out. Laws had changed and he could be extradited to the U.S., the country that had paid for his lifestyle and wanted him behind bars. Word on the street is that El Chapo had his cell door opened by a guard, after which he was taken through a bunch of other doors while hidden in a laundry basket. He was subsequently bundled into a car trunk and driven away. 78 people in all were involved in the escape, which cost El Chapo $2.5 million. Many of the people on the payroll were prison officials and the police. That's one story at least. Number 22. Another version of events says it wasn't a guard that opened the door, but 2 very high-level officials of the government. Now, let's see El Chapo's softer side. Number 21. We promised to tell you what he wrote in those love letters. He actually had 18 kids with 7 different women, but these words were for his lover, Zulema Hernandez. These days, my only comfort is thinking, especially thinking of you. Another went, darling, these days my only comfort is thinking, especially thinking of you, and of a day that I can hopefully live my life by your side. In November, he wrote, love, Christmas is around the corner and nothing would make me happier than being close to you, your skin and your lips, but everything is uncertain. Even though I haven't lost sight of seeing you, I don't want to promise any specific day because then it doesn't work out. Number 20. She ended up helping his cartel traffic tons of cocaine and might have gone to prison again for a long time if it weren't for El Chapo's formidable lawyers. In 2008, her body was found in the trunk of a car on the outskirts of Mexico City. She'd been shot in the head and the letter Z was carved into various parts of her body. That stood for Los Zetas, El Chapo's biggest rival. Number 19. In 2011, El Chapo's new partner and current wife, Emma Coronel Aspuro, gave birth to their twin girls. At the time, there was a $5 million bounty on his head, so his name wasn't on the birth certificates. In 2018, he famously started crying when he saw them both appear when he stood trial. Let's now see what happened to some of his other kids. Number 18. Some of his kids are now all grown up and helping run the Sinaloa cartel, which, while still strong, is arguably not top dog anymore. In 2020, two of those sons, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, sometimes called Los Chapito, were threatening people in Mexico who weren't staying indoors during the pandemic lockdown. Offenders only got a spanking, not killed. The same news story said his daughter Alejandrina was providing care packages for families in need. One of his daughters, Rosa Isela Guzman Ortiz, currently lives in the U.S. and works as a businesswoman. She has never been one to stay quiet, telling the media she thinks her father is not the man the media and the authorities have made him out to be. She also said he's never had that kind of money the media says he has. Number 17. Where all that money went to is still a mystery. The Guardian newspaper wrote that the cartel's profits from drug trafficking was $12,666,181,704, citing an official document used at his trial. That cash is still MIA. We guess we better tell you now how he even got to that point. Number 16. In 2006, there were 2,119 murders related to the drug war just in Mexico. That went up each year until 2011. The number was 12,358. This led to various crackdowns on narcos, and just in 2010, 53,000 of them were arrested. The thing is, only 1,000 of the arrested men were associates of the Sinaloa cartel. Because of this, some people said the Mexican president Felipe Calderón was on the side of the cartel. As you already know, there is the strong allegation that he worked with the DEA and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Nonetheless, good things never last when you're a criminal, and it seems El Chapo's days of having protection came to an end. He became Mexico's most wanted man and spent much of his time hiding out in the mountains. On February 22, 2014, he was finally arrested. Number 15. U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder said El Chapo had caused the death and destruction of millions of lives across the globe, calling the arrest a victory for the citizens of both Mexico and the United States. The U.S. still wanted to extradite him. He was looking at a sentence of 300 to 400 years in prison. El Chapo had other ideas, as you'll now see. Number 14. He might not have enjoyed special treatment this time in prison, but he managed to escape again. On July 11, 2015, he entered a tunnel that went from his shower all the way to a house just less than a mile away. The tunnel was not just some dirty crawl space. It was 5 foot 7 inches in height and 30 inches wide. It was filled with lights and air ducts and high-quality building materials. Even a motorcycle was found down there, either used to carry stuff or for El Chapo to ride during his escape. Number 13. His wife, Emma Coronel, is currently in prison in the U.S. She's pled guilty to federal drug trafficking charges, although U.S. authorities have also said she was behind his 2015 escape. News reports say she had to pay $1.4 million for that escape, which involved buying a plot of land near the prison and also doing a lot of digging. It seems she also paid some officials off, since a number of arrests were made. Number 12. Now an embarrassment to the Mexican government, it put up a reward of $3.8 million for information leading to El Chapo's arrest. Again, he hid out in the mountains among people that worked for him. He also had the support from many local people who still adored their Robin Hood figure. Number 11. The United States was furious again, with one official saying El Chapo had trafficked more than a line of cocaine for every single person in the U.S. As you'll soon find out, this might have been true, but it was also kind of a pointless statement. Drug flow never really stops, or at least it's only gotten worse over the decades since the war on drugs started. Number 10. As for El Chapo's personality, this is what one writer said about him. He had more mistresses than you can probably fathom. This was his existence, having sex with strange women and micromanaging every detail of his operation. A prison psychologist said he was egocentric, narcissistic, shrewd, persistent, tenacious, meticulous, discriminating, and secretive. One celebrity in the U.S. should know that better than anyone because he got to meet him. Number 9. While El Chapo was still hiding out, the actor Sean Penn rubbed shoulders with him. Penn was under no illusions that he was meeting with a dangerous man, writing this in a Rolling Stone article. "I've seen plenty of video and graphic photography of those beheaded, exploded, dismembered, or bullet-riddled innocents, activists, courageous journalists, and cartel enemies alike. The security was about as strict as you can get, but after numerous flights and lengthy car drives, Penn ended up in what he called mountainous jungle. After several more hours, he finally walked into a house and was greeted by El Chapo." Penn wrote, "He's wearing a casual patterned silk shirt, pressed black jeans, and he appears remarkably well-groomed and healthy for a man on the run." El Chapo told him later, "Talking about politicians, I keep my opinion to myself. They go do their thing and I do mine." At another point he said, "I supply more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world. I have a fleet of submarines, airplanes, trucks, and boats." Here are a few takeaways from a subsequent email interview Penn did. El Chapo said he got into the drug business at the age of 15 only because it was the only way to put food on the table. He said he didn't feel bad about what he did because he felt he was given few options in life. He also said if he didn't do it, someone else would. As for the violence, he said that was mostly down to envy and snitches, but he didn't feel like he was a violent person. Asked how he felt since he escaped, he replied, "Lots of happiness because of my freedom. That feeling wouldn't last long." Number 8. On January 8, 2016, he was arrested again, with the Mexican Army and Federal Police, Mexican Navy Special Forces bursting into the house where he was staying, killing 5 men. El Chapo almost got away again, but was picked up later by cops while fleeing in a stolen car. He offered them bribes, which they turned down. He then told them, "You're all going to die." The authorities found assault rifles, armored cars, grenade launchers, and more weapons back at the house. As you'll see, this was nothing compared to what the entire cartel owned. Number 7. It's said the Sinaloa cartel has employed around 20,000 soldiers and hitmen. Most were and still are armed with very modern weapons. On top of that, the cartel has at least 1 submarine. It also owns 15 helicopters, more than 100,000 armored vehicles, and about 500 narco tanks. The latter is not a real military tank, but trucks fitted with armor and guns. They come with turrets and weapon bays and usually have battering rams attached to the front. The closest thing you might have seen to one is in the movie Mad Max. Number 6. El Chapo didn't want to be extradited to the US, where he knew he'd have to spend the rest of his life in prison. A Mexican judge involved in his extradition was assassinated in 2016 while on his morning jog. But a few months later, El Chapo was in the US standing trial. On July 17, 2019, he was sentenced to life with a forfeiture of more than $12.6 billion. That means the state has the right to take money or property to that amount. The hunt for El Chapo was over now, but like the myth of Sisyphus, the job wasn't done. Number 5. The drug war costs the US taxpayer around $50 billion per year. Over the decades, it's cost trillions. Just hunting El Chapo cost billions. His trial, according to reports, cost $50 million. This has resulted in some folks asking if it's all worth it. A growing number of experts in the US call this system whack-a-mole because no sooner than El Chapo was in prison, he was replaced. Number 4. In fact, now he's staying at America's most secure prison, ADX Florence. The amount of cocaine coming into the US hasn't really changed. Overdoses, meanwhile, have been going up, mostly because of the powerful drug fentanyl being added to heroin and the rather shady business of Big Pharma's legal opioid drugs. In fact, in 2020, drug overdoses were up almost 30% in the US. This is what Jeffrey Miron, the director of the Department of Economics at Harvard University, said about the drug war and El Chapo's arrest. "We're choosing to throw money away to stop something we are never going to stop. So all the bragging and boasting about locking up El Chapo is meaningless. The counter-opinion is that drug use will worsen if there's no war. It would also be just as hard to dismantle a big industry." Number 3. The homicide rate in Mexico rose significantly after El Chapo was behind bars. 2018 and 2019 saw record-high drug war casualties amid all the turf wars. Some cities looked like war zones. Even in 2020 during the lockdowns, the murder rate barely changed. On top of that, authorities pointed out the worrying fact that cartels were murdering more journalists than officials. Some experts have explained this by saying when law enforcement gets better, organized crime gets more violent. On June 7, 2020, a record was broken in Mexico that was for the most murders committed in one day. The previous record was 114 in April 2020, and the new record was 117. The violence, of course, was mostly cartel and drug-related. Much of it was down to a new name in the media, El Mencho. This new supervillain is the head of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, now called the most violent cartel and the biggest criminal drug threat to the USA. It could be the biggest drug trafficker to the US right now, although US authorities reported in 2018 that the Sinaloa cartel still filled that position after El Chapo's arrest. Here's how one crime expert compared El Mencho to El Chapo. He's very secretive. He does not show himself. He's not a man of the people like El Chapo, who cultivated that cult of personality, a little bit like Pablo Escobar. He's part of an evolution of drug kingpins who want to keep themselves in the shadows. For that reason, you probably won't hear much about him, but make no mistake, he's as bad as anyone that came before him. Number 2. As for life behind bars, El Chapo doesn't get to do much at all except look at 4 walls in his tiny cell. Even when he's allowed out of his cell, it's just to a covered yard. According to his lawyers, he gets no natural light at all. In his own words, El Chapo said, "It's been torture, the most inhumane situation I have lived in my entire life. It has been physical, emotional, and mental torture." It got worse during the pandemic because prisoners weren't allowed visits. Even the few hours a week given for exercise was canceled to prevent prisoners from getting near guards. Still, we're sure the families of his victims won't mind this kind of suffering. Could he escape once more, though? Number 1. The answer is no. No way. He's staying in the most secure prison on Earth. There's no place to tunnel, and even if he managed to somehow get out of his cell, the entire prison is fitted with pressure mats that set off alarms. Even if he could get outside the walls, there's no place to run. The former warden said the extreme circumstance he's kept in is a fate worse than death. He's housed in the most secure unit called Range 13. It literally drives men crazy. A former inmate named Jack Powers can attest to that. While he was in the secure unit, he bit off both pinky fingers and removed his earlobes and other bits of himself. No one knows how long El Chapo will stay in isolation, but it's likely going to be a long time due to his history. We imagine now that he can only dream about those good old days when he used to sell oranges for enough pesos to drink a cold soda under a blue sky. You're walking in the desert just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, when you notice something strange. A little red ribbon tied to a small sagebrush plant. Why would someone have tied a ribbon around this desert shrub, an herbaceous plant that's widespread in certain areas of the American West? That's how you think you're a formal type of guy. You're clever too, and you've seen the entirety of Breaking Bad 3 times. You assume, of course, that the ribbon is tied around the shrub because some drug dealer who operates on a massive scale has buried millions of dollars nearby. You then look over your shoulder to ensure the cartels aren't watching. Hey, you've seen those chainsaw videos too, and you don't want to end up starring in a short film posted on LiveLeak. Nonetheless, you think I'm coming back at night with a shovel. It's an age-old problem for drug dealers, the ones who make a lot of cash. What does one do with all one's money? Stash it under the floorboards, fill the walls with it, bury it in the desert? You really have to do something with that cash, because if you don't, someone is likely going to take it from you. Police once raided the house of a Colombian drug dealer, and just sitting around was $29 million. In the drug world, that wasn't all that weird. A few years ago, the cops found up to $20 million at a house in Miami. The cash was hidden in buckets. We won't go on, but we will tell you that drug traffickers have had their stash taken many times, and the hiding places weren't always that great. It's not at some point the drug kingpin named Pablo Escobar was worth an astonishing $30 billion, and even today people are hunting for part of that buried treasure. In fact, Pablo's brother Roberto Escobar has said that buried somewhere out there, maybe in the desert, maybe in the walls of houses now occupied by unknowing tenants, are tens of millions of dollars. So with that in mind, maybe the next time you see a red ribbon tied to a shrub in the middle of nowhere, you should start digging. But what about the money that once belonged to El Chapo? Where did that go? How much was even worth? The problem is drug cartel bosses don't usually do their taxes, so it's hard to know how much they're worth. Forbes magazine actually had the Sinaloa cartel down as making a cool $3 billion a year during El Chapo's heyday. But we're guessing Forbes is pulling that number out of thin air. How would Forbes know? One time the Mexican army pulled over a car and inside was around $15.3 million, and that cash was said to be the property of one Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. We might not ever know exactly how much he had, but if you figure out how much he and his cartel friends got over the US-Mexican border, we can safely say he was incredibly rich. Maybe El Chapo made $1 billion. Let's just go with $1 billion for now. So the cops didn't just find El Chapo sitting with a bunch of suitcases filled with $1 billion. They didn't find a savings account belonging to one Joaquin Guzman Loera, and there were millions and millions of bucks in it. Before we get to hidden stashes, we should tell you that incredibly rich drug traffickers do the same as many other rich people in that they hide their money in offshore accounts. That's right, like former heads of government, celebrities, sports stars, business people, and even the British royal family, drug dealers get their money in these tax havens where the cash is kept away from the prying eyes of tax collectors. The money is just owned by what's called a shell company, meaning it's fake, inactive, and in reality just a name.
In 2016, it was discovered that another Mexican narcotics kingpin, a guy named Rafael Caro Quintero, had one of these accounts in Panama. He got some clever dude to take his drug money and diversify it and then make it look like that money belonged to a made-up business with accounts in the tax haven. In fact, a few years ago, the British banking giant HSBC admitted to laundering billions of dollars for Mexican and Colombian drug dealers. An investigation found that the Mexican cartels would turn up to a bank and in just one day hand over hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash to one single account. No questions asked, of course. The bank didn't even face criminal charges in the end, for the reason that an indictment might just topple the bank and subsequently endanger the financial system at large. HSBC just said it would defer bonuses for a few years and settle to the amount of $1.9 billion. And that was virtually nothing for HSBC. And you can bet a lot of bosses got some dope bonuses while they were dealing with the traffickers. No one did any hard time like you'd have to if you got pulled over with a bag of weed on you. Anyway, there's no doubt El Chapo has laundered a ton of money. When he stood trial, we found out about his personal zoo, his collection of jewel-encrusted guns and planes supposedly full of cash. But U.S. officials weren't quite sure where to look for the billions of dollars this guy could have earned. His indictment was valued at $14 billion, but that number was a bit of a guess based on how many drugs El Chapo and his cartel had trafficked. In fact, at the time, a former federal prosecutor in the U.S. said there was likely no way El Chapo had $14 billion hidden someplace, whether it be a hole in the desert or a bank account in Panama. Some people are saying that $14 billion was a fantasy figure, but he certainly had quite a lot of millions hidden somewhere. But where? Well, more recently, a 12-page document was released talking about the money trail. It said in drug shipments, El Chapo and his gang made $12,666,181,704. How they came up with an exact number is beyond explanation, but it is what it is. The investigators went looking for any legitimate business owned by the cartel, which is what the traffickers did to make their money legal. The problem is U.S. investigators can do nothing about cash that was spent on businesses in Mexico. One investigator said cartel guys, or guys that worked for the cartel, would arrive in the U.S. with prepaid credit cards loaded with millions of dollars. They could then make a giant purchase, such as lots of high-grade computers. Then they'd export the computers, and the cash from the sale ended up not in the U.S. but in Mexico. One person who testified against El Chapo said the man did indeed spend a lot, but he spent all that cash in Mexico. He bought things like private planes, yachts, and had lavish properties all over the place. The U.S. can do nothing about that. What was bought in Mexico stays in Mexico. In fact, two wives of former cartel members said sometimes vast quantities of street money would be taken through the U.S. into stash houses in Mexico. They'd use counting machines there to count the millions and then package that cash, but where did it go? That's the billion-dollar question. Guzman's wife doesn't act or live like a billionaire, but she's certainly not broke. People who testified against him also said that the cartel buys things like dairy farms and shopping malls. The Mexican local authorities might turn a blind eye because the cartel also invests in things such as charities and sports teams. El Chapo's wife, by the way, one Emma Coronel Guzman, has stood by her husband and said that he's a humble man, and a lot of lies have been told about him. She said the U.S. government and the media has overblown just how big he was in the drug trafficking. And she has also said the billions he's presumed to have or be hiding just doesn't exist. She doesn't deny that he was a powerful man, so powerful in fact that she's gone on record saying the Mexican government wanted him dead. The reason for that, she says, was because he knew too much, meaning he had made many friends in the government during his drug trafficking days. She's even been called the narco princess Diana, since she's been known to be charitable. But does she have billions of dollars? So far, she's not done anything that would tell us she has a ton of cash. No doubt her accounts have also been investigated. When asked about just how much cash she has and how she earns her money, this is what she said in an interview. "I have irrigation land, things like that, which I prefer not to talk about. I do not have anything illegal. I know the government has been checking or verifying if I have something unlawful. Investigations have found that she gets payments from what was called her legal counsel, but she doesn't live a glamorous lifestyle and lives in a pretty normal, if not nice, house in Mexico. Obviously, if she did have billions, she wouldn't be flaunting it, but right now the money trail doesn't lead back to her. The DEA has said different and has spoken out about how this former beauty queen does actually live a fairly lavish life. The agency has said the Mexican government could get on the money trail, but it criticized Mexican officials for not even trying to find the money. Hey, maybe some people are still on the payroll. As for Guzman's two sons, well, they're both wanted men and both in the drug trafficking game. One of them drives around in a $220,000 car, so you would think that the Guzman family isn't short on cash. Some reports suggest that it is these two sons who are paying paying off the Mexican government, and that's why El Chapo's billions will never be found. El Chapo has bribed a lot of people in the past, but right now he doesn't have many options given the fact that he's locked down in a pretty much modern dungeon and is allowed very few visits. A former assistant U.S. attorney has said that El Chapo will certainly have shell companies, but finding these offshore companies won't be easy because they will be well hidden. So far, the U.S. has recovered very little, and the Mexican government has been accused of accepting bribes from the cartels. While El Chapo is in prison, the drug trade still flourishes, and most people agree that the war on drugs cannot ever be won. Right now, the Sinaloa cartel and other cartels are hiring very clever attorneys and other professionals to hide and invest their money. These days, you can't walk up to an HSBC bank with $500,000 and say, "I'd like to make a deposit." Something the cartels do now is hire huge gangs of people to deposit less than $10,000 in a bank account. That way, the cash stays off the radar, but don't be fooled into thinking anything has really changed. The cash still flows like a river that's burst its banks. More recent reports said that the Mexican president wants any money from El Chapo to go back to Mexico. After all, it was earned in Mexico. El Chapo himself has said that if the cash does get back to Mexico, he wants it to go to the country's poorest folks, the indigenous communities. Alas, no one has found El Chapo's cash. The U.S., meanwhile, has spent about $50 billion last year in its war against drugs, with around $20 to $30 billion being spent on heroin and cocaine prohibition. Obviously, that wasn't all spent on hunting down cartel members, but you can safely say it cost a few billion to catch El Chapo. Meanwhile, other drug lords have taken over and cocaine consumption in the U.S. is on the rise. We doubt El Chapo's cash will be in a hole in the desert next to a sagebrush plant, but you never know. One day you might see that red ribbon. Nonetheless, it's much more likely his money is tied up in properties and legitimate businesses, as well as hidden in offshore accounts next to other very wealthy people's money. Right now, you have to watch these two videos.